bbc.com/classic.
Good evening. It's Monday the 30th of May. Our top stories tonight. No consensus. Pacific Island leaders reject a sweeping regional trade and security pact with China. Labor wins an outright majority in Parliament as the coalition confirms its new leadership team. At least 21 killed after a small passenger plane crashes in Nepal. And the robots taking over in Singapore as the nation tackles its labour shortage problems. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. A little later, the war in Ukraine adding stress to the already strained global food supply. China has fallen short in its ambitious bid to sign up 10 Pacific nations to a wide-ranging trade and security deal. The country's foreign minister met with his Pacific counterparts at a top-level summit in the Fijian capital this afternoon. But in the end, China has had to shelve the pact, having failed to secure the support it needed. Here's our Foreign Affairs reporter, Stephen Jedgetz, who is in Suva.
Talk loudly and carry a big stick. Wang Yi's carving a path through the Pacific on his 8-nation tour, determined to cement China's commercial, security and strategic ties, while also assuring the West it has nothing to fear.
My advice to these people is don't be too anxious and don't be too nervous.
Today he sat down for a virtual meeting with 10 Pacific Island foreign ministers. On the table, a sweeping regional agreement first leaked last week, which would tie China and the Pacific together across trade, development, policing and cybersecurity.
The common development and prosperity of China and developing countries will only mean greater harmony, greater progress and greater justice across the whole world.
But the proposed agreement is contentious, with Pacific leaders warning the region could be sucked into a new Cold War.
We are concerned about the potential extent to which the nature of those agreements could extend across the whole of the Pacific.
And after today's meeting, Fiji's Prime Minister delicately hinted the agreement has been put aside, at least for now.
As always, we put consensus first among our countries throughout any discussion on new regional agreements.
China's ambassador confirming after his foreign minister left the room that it had been shelved, while Beijing tries to convince the doubters.
Of course, there are some concerns on some specific issues. And we have agreed that these two documents will be discussed afterwards.
Strategic jousting is unavoidable in the current era, with Western powers trying to compete against an increasingly authoritarian and ambitious China. Pacific Island countries are happy to leverage that when they can, but they're also urging the bigger players not to forget about the most existential threats.
We all know plenty of eyes have been on Suva during this visit. I hope we also know that geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas.
And that will require cooperation, not just competition. Stephen Jedgetz, ABC News, Suva.
And earlier this evening, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese confirmed he has spoken with his Fijian counterpart, Frank Bainimarama. Mr Albanese tweeted Australia is committed to working with Fiji to tackle the climate crisis and says he's looking forward to continuing cooperation on a number of issues, including the Pacific Islands Forum, COVID and labour mobility. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has made a rare trip to visit his troops on the front line in eastern Ukraine. The president went to Kharkiv, the second largest city where more than 2,000 apartment buildings have been destroyed. He met with officials to talk about reconstruction in the region and handed out medals to his troops.
I want to thank each of you for your service. You risk your life for all of us and for our state. Thank you for defending the independence of our country.
Russian soldiers supported by intense shelling have fired on 46 communities in Donetsk and Luhansk in their fight to take control of the eastern Donbass region. Rescue workers in Nepal have so far recovered 21 bodies from the crash site of a small plane that went down during cloudy weather on Sunday. It had been carrying 22 people and was bound for Jomsom, a popular tourist and pilgrimage site. The wreckage of the plane, operated by Nepali carrier Tara Air, was recovered in the district of Mustang in northern Nepal earlier today. It had taken off from the tourist town of Pokhara, 125 kilometres west of the capital Kathmandu. Well, the ABC is now predicting that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese will lead a majority government, with the Melbourne seat of Macnamara now expected to go to Labor. Here's Chief Election Analyst Anthony Green.
At the end of counting on Monday night, it's clear that the Albanese government has achieved a basic majority. We're giving the Labor Party 76, the Coalition 57, 4 Greens, 12 others, 2 seats remain in doubt. What we've done today is we've given away the electorate of Macnamara. Now, this has been a very complex three-cornered contest. Labor's in first, Greens second, Liberals third, but the exclusion of these candidates was making it a very close contest where all 3 candidates had a little over 33% of the vote. Who dropped out would determine the winner. In the end, Labor is still 400 votes ahead of the Greens at a critical point of the count. Liberals had moved into first place, and that's enough, with less than 2,000 votes to come, to be able to declare that Josh Burns will be re-elected as a member for Macnamara, bringing the Albanese government to 76 seats. The other seats remaining in doubt at the end of today are Gilmore on the south coast of New South Wales. Andrew Constance is the former Transport Minister in New South Wales. Today, the absent votes heavily favoured Labor, and Labor is back in front by about 140 votes after being behind by 210 yesterday. And at this stage, with the trend in the absence, it may well be that Labor also wins Gilmore, but it remains in doubt in this stage. The other seat that hasn't been given away is Deakin. It has narrowed for the Liberal Party today, and the Labor is now closer. It's only on 49.7 as opposed to 49.5. But it hasn't been narrowing quickly enough to suspect that Labor can still get ahead. At this stage, the Liberals would be favour. Michael Sukkar, the former Assistant Treasurer, holds the seat. So at this stage, Deakin is still in doubt, but leaning towards the Liberal Party. But definitely given away is Macnamara and Gilmore. Labor's now ahead, but still too close to call.
Well, still reeling from their election loss, the Liberals and Nationals have elevated 2 new men to lead their parties in opposition. Former Defence Minister Peter Dutton is urging voters to see beyond his hard-edged reputation as he looks to hold the Albanese government to account. Meanwhile, the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has been defeated in a contest for the Nationals leadership. His political editor, Andrew Green.
From the ruins of defeat, Peter Dutton emerges unopposed as Liberal leader. His attitude immediate.
To clean up Labor's mess in 3 years' time. They are going to be a bad government. There's no doubt in my mind.
The coalition hard man's deputy, regional Liberal MP Susan Lee, quick to acknowledge where their work is needed most.
My message to the women of Australia is, we hear you, we heard you, and we are determined to earn back your trust and your faith.
The man who lost it commending the new leadership team.
Deeply committed Australians to both the Liberal cause and, of course, the cause of the nation.
But Scott Morrison's successor, a former policeman, indicating he'll back a strong anti-corruption watchdog.
I'm a strong supporter of the ICAC. I believe in transparency, and I always have.
Mr Morrison sledged ICAC as a kangaroo court, but matters of integrity helped sweep Teal independents to power, knocking out many moderate Liberals from their inner city seats.
I commend the motion to the House.
Peter Dutton accepting he was wrong to walk out on the historic apology to the stolen generations 14 years ago.
I made a mistake in relation to the apology. At the time, I believed that the apology should be given when the problems were resolved, and the problems are not resolved.
A changing of the guard too in the Nationals party room. David Littleproud becoming leader of the junior coalition party, ousting Barnaby Joyce, who City Liberals blame for suppressing their vote.
It's using common sense and being in the sensible centre. That's where you win elections, not chasing extremities.
Well, I suppose you think I'm sad. Not really.
With former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg among those lost to the Teals, Peter Dutton was the Liberals' only real option. He comes to the job a well-known political figure, but the tough man public persona he's long projected needs some adjustment, his colleagues say. As for the man himself, he says it's not a question of being different, but being better understood.
I'll just go.
A 21-year veteran of politics asking to be looked at afresh. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, let's return to Fiji, where foreign ministers from 10 Pacific countries met virtually with their Chinese counterpart Wang Yi. Despite agreeing on some areas of cooperation, there was no consensus on a sweeping economic and security agreement proposed by China. Reporter Lithe Mavono says much of the detail of the meeting remains a mystery.
The media, as well as any other members of the civil society or even the public, was allowed anywhere near the Grand Pacific Hotel where most, if not all, of Wang Yi's meetings took place. We do know that all of those who were part of this meeting joined virtually. We know as well that there was not consensus, which means that not all 10 of the countries of the Pacific Islands who have relationships with the People's Republic of China agreed to the terms of this deal.
And Fiji's Prime Minister made some opening remarks after the meeting. What did you make of the comments around climate change?
Well, my understanding from the way that the Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama spoke is that he felt that he had in China partners who were willing to placate or to address the Pacific Island nations and the sort of demands that they've had over the past several years with regards to partners reducing global emissions. He sounded as if he was friendlier towards the Chinese, given that the Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong just left the country a few days ago.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yet China itself is lagging behind as well in terms of their efforts on climate change.
That's right. Although the Chinese government has in recent weeks, and we suspect that comments were directed at the Australian government, the incoming one, China has told the Pacific Island countries that it intends to, and I quote a little bit, to say, do what the Australians have promised but won't, and what the Americans have promised and haven't. So it sounds like they intend to help the Pacific Islands in that way. However, well, the one demand that the Pacific Island governments and the youth climate action movement has made off of Australia over the past few years is a reduction in its coal and gas exploration. And so, interestingly, it is China who is the biggest importer of coal out of Australia.
Yeah. What else did Frank Bainimarama say about any future deals with China? Would they be a multilateral? Would it be a multilateral approach, or still the bilateral relationship that they've had in the past?
This tour that the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi made is two-faced in that way, or multifaceted, let's call it that. With every government he visited, there is a separate bilateral conversation happening. So there are deals that it's signed directly with this government. So, for example, there is a 3-point deal it's made with Fiji in various sectors: agriculture, tourism, trade, climate change, health. And then at the same time, this wider, broad-based partnership that it intends to sign with all of its Pacific friends is multilateral in its approach. And so, therefore, it requires consensus of all 10 of those Pacific Island countries.
China said that that the nations in the region should not be concerned about its ambitions in the region. Is there any comfort from those words, or is there a sense that they will continue to revisit this until they get what they are after?
Well, I think given the way that the rest of the Pacific have responded quite swiftly to when revelations of these deals and the partnerships that China intends to have with the Solomon Islands, given the way in which the Pacific Island governments responded swiftly and the way the Solomon Islands government was itself summoned to Fiji only a few weeks ago to explain their position and to explain the deal, and given that today, despite a lengthy tour across the Pacific Islands, the governments of the Pacific did not reach a consensus, we can gather from that there is still some reservation, there's still some concern. There are quite a few countries in the Pacific who are very close to our Western allies and Western friends, and so there's still not a resolution as to whether or not Pacific Island countries feel safe and feel that there are no strings attached to the help that will be coming from China.
Letha, you're an experienced reporter. Have you ever encountered this kind of event, this kind of secrecy, this kind of issue where the media is not invited and not welcome?
No, Beverly, I must say, sadly, I've never experienced what seemed to me, what was very confusing over the past 48 hours in which Wang Yi actually conducted meetings and toured Suva. In the first day of his tour, he met with the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Foreign Secretariat, His Excellency Mr. Henry Puna, and I watched as visiting Chinese officials tried to physically remove cameramen that the PIFs or the Foreign Secretariat had allowed onto the premises to just video and photograph the initial meet and greet of the two leaders. I watched as Chinese government media and Chinese officials tried to stand in the way of these cameramen so that they wouldn't be able to do their work. And I must say, I was confused in the few minutes and seconds that I saw that happen. Thankfully, the Foreign Secretariat were very vocal in their insistence that they would not suppress or oppress the media and that they would allow the Pacific media to conduct itself in the way that free media does. Today, we were constantly reminded and removed from places which other branches of the Fijian government had allowed us into, and we were treated like criminals, really. And the way in which the press event post-meeting was conducted this afternoon, where each of us was vetted by the Chinese officials, both visiting and resident, and then even our media passes were issued by the government of China. They were not issued by local police or local government authorities, which is usually the case when there is a high-level foreign dignitary visiting, or even when there is a high-level government event. We were told that we could not ask questions, and then when we did ask questions, a colleague of mine from the ABC Bureau in Canberra asked a question, and he was physically restrained by government of Fiji officials and told to sit down by Chinese military who were in the room. So it was very confusing, and I must say it was frightening. I was quite rattled.
Yeah, quite a confronting experience. Well, good to get your first-hand perspective there, Letha. Thank you so much.
Binaka.
Well, tensions have flared in East Jerusalem as thousands of right-wing Israelis marched to the city to celebrate its capture more than 50 years ago. The annual flag march is seen by Palestinians as a provocation, and there are fears it could set off a fresh wave of violence in the city. Our Middle East correspondent, Alison Horn.
Before the march even began, tensions were at boiling point. Police used rubber-tipped bullets and pepper spray to disperse Palestinian protesters from Jerusalem's old city, clearing the way for tens of thousands of Israeli nationalists to mark the capture of East Jerusalem in the 1967 war. For them, it's a celebration.
It's not like we're not trying to do something wrong or something, and it's our country.
Came to dance for Jerusalem. My neighbors aren't so happy that we're here, but we didn't come to annoy them.
Palestinians who want the eastern section as the capital of a future state see this event as a provocation. The friction further fuelled by racist chants like "Death to Arabs."
They behave like we don't exist. We don't live here.
I feel very sad to see how the people behave towards me. If I complain, the police will blame me.
This area here is Damascus Gate, and these Israelis will go through the gate into the old city and through the Muslim quarter. This area is really considered the heart of Jerusalem for Palestinians. They've been banned from here today in an attempt to de-escalate tensions.
Those who got near were quickly thwarted by police. 3 Israelis and dozens of Palestinians were injured in the clashes. The Palestinian militant group Hamas has threatened retaliation. There are fears the violence could escalate. Alison Horn, ABC News, Jerusalem.
The US Justice Department says it'll conduct a review of the police response to the nation's deadliest school shooting in a decade. President Joe Biden visited memorials at the Robb Elementary School in Texas, where a gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers. Anger is growing over why armed officers waited outside a classroom for more than 40 minutes while children inside made panic 911 calls. The community of Uvalde is calling for concrete action. The president responded saying, "We will," before going on to meet parents of the murdered children. Well, as the war in Ukraine grinds on, leaders are warning the hold-up of grain exports is adding to an already dire food security situation in some parts of the world. The UN's Food Price Index hit an all-time high in March, and experts are warning the overlapping impacts of COVID, climate change, natural disasters and conflict are causing a devastating global food crisis. Dr. Rachel Carey is a senior lecturer in food systems at the University of Melbourne. She says the war is adding to an already fragile system.
We're seeing food prices rising. They have been rising, in fact, since about 2020. So it's not just the war in Ukraine, but clearly the war in Ukraine is having an impact. We saw global food prices hit an all-time high in March in terms of the global food price index. So I think it's certainly having an impact, but there are actually many different shocks and stresses that are affecting the global food system currently.
Well, give us a context of what's impacting and how it compares to historic shortages.
Sure. So I think the things you need to be aware of is that there's multiple shocks and stresses that are currently compounding, all coming together and having this effect on global food prices. So yes, we have the war in Ukraine currently, and of course Russia and Ukraine together account for around 28% of global wheat exports. Also really important in terms of exports of things like sunflower seeds and sunflower oil, also other types of grains and wheats, things like barley and corn, etc. So that's certainly having an impact. Russia is also the world's major exporter of fertilizers. And of course, Russia's been really important for supplies of global oil, and oil underpins the entire food system, everything from fuel on farm, also just to production of fertilizers and through, of course, to transportation of food. Then we have the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has significantly impacted food systems right the way through our food supply chains, and everything from shortages of labour, just having enough labour to actually pick crops on farm and then to pack and transport those crops as well. But then thirdly, of course, we've also got the impacts of climate change around the world. So we have, of course, what we've seen here ourselves. We've had floods, we've had bushfires, and prior to that, we've had drought as well. And we're seeing these kinds of impacts of climate change around the world. So I think we need to be aware that it's not just the war that's happening in Ukraine, it's also a whole range of other factors and pressures affecting global food systems.
Yeah, so it's almost like this perfect storm. Which countries are feeling the impact the most?
Well, the countries that are feeling the impact the most are those that are most dependent on imports. And unfortunately, they are some of the poorest countries in the world as well. So they're countries in parts of Africa, countries in parts of Asia as well, who are really feeling the impacts. These are places sometimes where people might be spending half of their spending on food and are left with very little really to spend on other things as well. Of course, here we are a big food exporter, and so we're buffered a little bit from those increases in global food prices. I think people will certainly be feeling it at the supermarket checkout, but we're not feeling it as much as in those other countries that are very dependent on food imports.
Yeah. You know, you talk about us being a sort of a big exporter, so we're cushioned to a degree, but do you think the Australian government has been taking, the system seriously enough, and should we be doing more to prioritise food supplies?
That's a really good question. I think we should be doing a lot more to prioritise our food supplies. We think of ourselves as being a big food exporter, which we are, but that does not make us food secure. We need to be doing more to plan to make our food systems much more resilient to these shocks and stresses in the future, because unfortunately, this is a long-term trend. These shocks and stresses are not going to stop when we look at the impacts of climate change. For instance, we're seeing these shocks and stresses much more frequently on our own food system here. So it's something that we really need government to be planning actively for how to strengthen the resilience of our food systems in the long term.
And we perhaps have greater capacity to adapt. When you're looking at some of the nations that you're talking about, they're highly stressed in many cases. The systems have been run down and the processes have been run down. So what can they do to get back on track?
Well, I think for some of those poorer countries in the world, some of the countries that are really dependent on food imports, it's partly about ensuring that you're producing as much of those staple foods internally, domestically, as possible as a buffer against those spikes in global food prices. It's really about supporting smaller scale farmers who produce much of the world's food and who are sometimes themselves not able to afford sufficient food as well. And then, of course, just in terms of sufficient income and sufficient social protection for people when they are affected by these rising food prices.
Yeah. You know, how do vulnerable countries shift from necessarily a emergency mindset to one that is planning and supported?
I think that's a really good question. We do tend to focus on the short-term emergency food handouts, but of course, what we really need to be focusing on is the long-term planning. And I think, again, that gets back to what I was saying about really supporting smaller scale farmers in those countries who are producing much of the world's food. They're really struggling with the impacts of climate change and ensuring that people have sufficient social protection mechanisms in place so that they are cushioned against these impacts. But it's really the long-term planning, really, that government needs to undertake. All countries should be planning for this, including our own.
You know, when you think of, say, how voracious nations like China have become and developed nations, we expect so much to be available to us sort of 24/7, you know, 12 months of the year. Does that mindset have to shift a little?
I think it does, in the sense that we need to be more prepared for those sorts of shocks to our food system. I guess the first time in Australia during COVID-19 was the first time many people may have seen that supermarket shelves were empty. They couldn't always find what they wanted to at the time they wanted to buy that food. And I think that we are going to see a bit more of that in future. Clearly, there was sufficient food on supply shelves. We're not going hungry here in Australia. Those of us who can afford to buy the food that's on the shelves, that's really the critical issue. There is currently food on the shelves in Australia that many people cannot afford to buy. And it's really about government planning to ensure that everybody can afford sufficient healthy food, and that it's a basic and fundamental human right.
Let's come back to Ukraine and Russia. Russia itself is withholding exports. They're not allowing them to move out of the ports. You know, if that continues, is it like a declaration of war on food, as has been said?
Look, I don't know if I would call it a declaration of war on food, but I think, you know, we can say that it is having a significant impact on the global food system. And unfortunately, it's likely to continue to do that for some time. This doesn't look like a situation that's going to resolve anytime soon.
Good to talk, Rachel. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
A climate protester has attempted to smash the glass protecting the Mona Lisa in Paris. A man disguised as an old lady in a wheelchair smeared the surface with cream after the bulletproof glass proved impenetrable. Staff at the Louvre were left to clean up the mess as the protester was led away. The Da Vinci painting was not damaged during the incident. A glass-bottomed bridge in northwest Vietnam has taken out the record as the longest of its kind in the world. Stretching more than 600 metres, the walkway connects visitors to a popular mountain resort. Thrill seekers from around the world are expected to flock to the tourist destination after today's grand opening. Some visitors, though, had to hold on to the rail for comfort, while others were too nervous to even complete a full crossing.
I dared not look down as I'm afraid of heights, and I imagined in my head what would have happened if I fell through. It made me too scared to keep on going.
If you look down and walk, it shows you have nerves of steel. At first it makes you panic, but then if you walk over around 10 glass panels, that feeling is gone. After that, it feels solid.
Suspended 150 metres in the air, the bridge is strong enough to hold up to 450 people at a time. Our top stories tonight on the world. 10 Pacific Island nations have rejected a region-wide trade and security deal with China. The ABC projects Labor to form a majority government as the coalition opposition elects new leaders. And at least 21 people are dead after a small passenger plane crashes in Nepal. Well, let's return to our top story. Pacific Island countries have walked away from a region-wide trade and security deal with China. The agreement has been put to one side after a high-level meeting between the Chinese and Pacific foreign ministers in Suva. Former Tuvalu Prime Minister Anela Sopoaga says Australia needs to mend its relationships in the region and also believes Foreign Minister Penny Wong should have made more stops on her whirlwind visit.
We are not the backdoor backyard of Australia. With all due respect, Pacific Island nations are independent sovereign countries. They are in the United Nations. And I think this needs to be translated into proper, respectful engagement with island nations. Visiting one country will not fix the problem. In fact, it will further create some sort of feelings amongst the other Pacific Island countries. 10 years ago, we didn't have that. Because our partnership with Australia was strong. Australia and Pacific Island countries, including my own, were engaged in tangible economic and social development projects, and they are visible in the island nations. The visibility of Australia was there. There was a lapse and suddenly an absence of that partnerships of concrete physical presence of Australia in Tuvalu and many other countries. And I think that's when we allowed an opportunity for the camel, to put its influence, and in came big interventions by China in the Pacific, as well as trying to put its nose in the Pacific Island Leaders Forum. And now I think the 2 feet of the camel are already in.
Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has denied speculation that President Vladimir Putin is ill during an interview with French television. There's been increasing unconfirmed speculation in both mainstream and social media that Mr. Putin, who turns 70 later this year, may be suffering from ill health, possibly cancer. Mr. Lavrov has also used the interview to say he believes people living in territories in Ukraine, where Russia is conducting its military operation, should be allowed to decide their own future. Shopping malls and parks have reopened in Shanghai as the city edges closer to scrapping lockdown restrictions. The Chinese financial hub was crippled by a massive outbreak of COVID infections in March, leading to 2 months of stay-at-home orders. But mass testing and a crackdown on gatherings has brought cases down from a peak of 20,000 to just dozens ahead of Wednesday's reopening. 20% of stores were allowed to open across the weekend with strict measures put to the test. It's unclear how gradual restrictions will ease this week, with public transport still suspended for much of the city. Well, let's return to Jerusalem, where tensions between Israel and Palestine have boiled over during the annual flag march. Let's get more with our Middle East correspondent, Alison Horn. Alison, good to have you with us. Firstly, give us a sense about Jerusalem Day and how significant it is.
For Israelis, it's incredibly significant. They consider this day, a Jerusalem Day, to be a celebration of their capture of East Jerusalem in 1967. What we saw was about 70,000 right-wing Israelis descending through the streets of Jerusalem and ending up inside the old city, which is under occupation, military occupation. So it is considered incredibly important, a celebration that Israelis say is a time for them to sing and dance and chant and celebrate, in their words, their freedom of this part of the world. But for Palestinians, it's considered deeply offensive. It is seen as provocative and an offence on the military occupation of which they live in East Jerusalem. Now, what we saw yesterday, what you just alluded to, was incredibly tense scenes. Before the march had even started, we saw Palestinians inside the old city
being dispersed by security forces. They were using rubber-tipped bullets, pepper spray, clubs, as clashes started inside the old city. Now, they were being dispersed before the large bulk of those Israelis arrived at the old city, because those people, the Palestinians, had actually been banned from being in that area to try to de-escalate tensions. However, we saw that at least 40 Palestinians were injured in these clashes and around 3 Israelis as well.
Was the route the normal route, or was it more contentious this year?
It is the normal route, however, it is different from last year's route, so I'll provide a little bit of context for that. So last year, Hamas, the militant group Hamas, which controls Gaza, approached the Israeli government, putting pressure on the Israeli government to change the route of the march so that it did not go through the Muslim quarter of the old city. Now, under pressure last year, that route was changed. However, this year, the route has gone back to the original procession. That meant that about 70,000 people who were part of that march came down through Jerusalem into East Jerusalem and entered into the old city. Now, about 8,000 of those people came through Damascus Gate, which leads directly into the Muslim quarter. And this is seen as particularly offensive to Palestinians, because that area there around Damascus Gate and heading into the Muslim quarter is really seen as the heart of East Jerusalem for Palestinians, which is why this route was considered so potentially contentious this year, even though it has been the route that has been taken before.
Yeah. From some of the vision that we're seeing, it seems as if the people marching with the flags were also being quite provocative, with very sort of racist slurs levelled at many of the Palestinians.
That's right. We were there for about 4 hours yesterday, and we heard racist slurs including death to Arabs, death to their land. Some other slurs that I probably can't quite mention on TV, but there was a lot of tension in the air, and some really unpleasant remarks that were being made by some members of the Israeli contingent that participated in this march. Other people that we spoke to who were taking part in Jerusalem Day said that they didn't ascribe to those sort of racist slurs, that they thought that they were offensive, and they didn't want to create any harm or any offence to Palestinians, but that they were there because they felt like it was a chance for them to celebrate their freedom. But as you've just mentioned, those incredibly distressing scenes of the violence that broke out, not just in the march and in the old city, but also around the old city, because for hundreds of metres around that area, it was cordoned off. It was physically blocked off by police. So for people who were trying to get in there, Palestinians who were trying to access, let's say, their businesses or maybe even their homes, and they couldn't get in there, it was incredibly distressing for those people. And Palestinians who had businesses in the area or who lived in the area were asked, or actually even forced in some cases, to shut their businesses and to stay inside.
Alison, have things calmed down a little today, or are there concerns that there could be sort of ramifications?
Look, things still do feel tense, but this has been the trend that we've seen here in Jerusalem, and in fact this entire region for the last 2 months. There's been a number of terror attacks on Israeli civilians. There's been increasing raids in the occupied West Bank by Israeli security forces. So it is in general just a tense mood between the two groups. But what we heard yesterday was threats from Hamas, the Palestinian militant group, that there would be retaliation. So far, that has not come to light. What we have seen is Hamas has fired a number of rockets into the sea, test rockets, perhaps just a show of force or a show of might to the people of Gaza. But so far there hasn't been any direct retaliation on Jerusalem. Hamas has said that it will retaliate in its own time, so whether or not that means that there could be something down the track, we're yet to know. But I guess the reason that this is so important, why we're watching it so
follow closely is during last year's march, Hamas actually fired rockets at Jerusalem, and that's what kicked off that 11-day war last year. So this is why people here have been taking those threats so seriously.
Yeah. Alison Horn in Jerusalem, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Well, in Sri Lanka, police have fired tear gas and water cannon on medical students protesting near the president's official residence. Demonstrators are demanding the resignation of President Rajapaksa over the country's economic crisis. A lack of foreign currency has led to shortages of food and fuel as well as critical medicines. Protests have been ongoing since late March. Well, labour shortages are stretching industries around the world in the wake of the pandemic. Wage rises and other incentives are gradually bringing people back into the workforce, but businesses in Singapore are taking a different approach. Technology advances have opened the door to robots filling vacant jobs, from librarians to baristas. Here's Tyson Whelan.
They say many hands make light work, but who said they had to be human hands? Singapore, like many countries around the world, is experiencing widespread labour shortages as it emerges from pandemic restrictions. So it's out with the old, in with the robots.
I think things have still not got back to pre-COVID. I don't think they ever will. So actually replacing the need for manpower on site with autonomous solutions is gaining real traction in the industry.
From the construction set to change the city skyline to your daily cup of coffee, these droids are picking up the slack where workers are not. Workforce shortages are biting around the world. US labour force participation rate is still down more than 1.2% on pre-pandemic levels. There remains nearly 2 vacant jobs for every American classified as unemployed. A February report found 85% of Australian businesses are running low on staff.
We are solving a universal problem within F&B, not just Singapore or Japan, but around the world. And automation will come in to assist us.
This robot does the job of 2 people, scanning this project to capture the construction's progress. 200,000 foreign workers have left Singapore since 2019 in a country of just 5.6 million people. It means libraries have called upon the robotics industry to fulfill the scarcity.
Staff need not read the call numbers one by one on the shelf, and this reduces the routine and labour-intensive aspects of this task.
It's argued half of workers' daily tasks will be automated by 2055, with mundane and physically demanding jobs first to go. But some customers say nothing beats a friendly, human smile.
We always want to have some kind of human touch for everything, and the food is a very important part too. So whenever we order food, we interact with a person.
Tyson Whelan, ABC News.
More than 40 people have died in floods and landslides caused by heavy rain in Brazil. The army has been mobilised to search for dozens who are still missing and to help the hundreds of people who are now displaced. This is the South American nation's 4th major flooding event in 5 months. In February, torrential downpours in the mountains of Rio de Janeiro state killed more than 230 people. And wild weather has wreaked havoc across South Australia as a low-pressure system pushes across the southeast. Adelaide's northern suburbs were the worst affected, with emergency services receiving hundreds of calls for help as houses were damaged and roads flooded. Tonight, hundreds remain without power.
A rude awakening for the residents of Salisbury as a flash tornado ripped through Adelaide's north about 5 a.m. The storm left a path of destruction through some streets, leaving others untouched.
While we were laying in bed, all we could see was sparks, and that was from the tree hitting the power lines, and then bang, this tree fell.
Carnage, tiles come off the roof, leaks inside, yeah, it's insane.
Rubbish, you name it, was up in the air about 150 metres above me. It's all swirling around.
The State Emergency Service received more than 200 calls for help, 3/4 of those from the Salisbury area, where wind gusts uprooted trees, felled power lines and sent gutters and fences flying. More than 55 millimetres of rain lashed the northern suburbs, causing major traffic delays, flooding front yards and turning back lawns into swimming pools.
Just don't know what to do, where to start, where to end.
Locals left to repair what they can while they wait for insurance companies to respond.
It's a bit hard, but as long as everyone's safe, that's the main thing.
Almost 1,800 homes and businesses were left without power, including this medical clinic, where almost 2,000 vaccines had to be binned.
All our tetanus, all our children's immunisations, flu, Pfizer, all gone.
The damage to the Salisbury area is extensive, and while clean-up efforts are well underway, it could take days to clear the debris. The SES is asking for patience.
But I've been ringing and I'm not getting people looking after me. I'm 86.
We're certainly working through these requests for assistance as quickly as we can, but it's likely that we won't be able to clear all of them today, and we may well be working through tomorrow.
The strong cold front and low pressure system which brought the weather continues to be felt, causing large swells across the west coast and sending rain to the state's far north. A severe weather warning remains in place across most of SA. Sarah Temevska, ABC News, Adelaide.
AGL Energy has abandoned plans to split off its coal-fired power stations, saying it didn't think the move would get enough support from shareholders. It's a win for the company's biggest shareholder, billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes, who'd campaigned against the move. The company's chair and CEO will resign.
A tech billionaire's slick campaign to rewrite AGL's future strategy has actually worked.
I need you to help us vote against and defeat the demerger.
Australia's biggest energy company is no longer planning to spin off its coal-fired power stations into a separate entity.
It's a win for corporate democracy in this particular case, and hopefully for people voting for the opportunities of decarbonisation for Australia.
AGL's long-held demerger plan was due to be voted on next month. It's now been scrapped. In an update to the ASX, the company said given the opposition from a small number of investors, including Mike Cannon-Brookes' Grok Ventures, the demerger will not receive sufficient support. AGL's decision comes after the billionaire's 2 failed takeover bids and a share raid that's made him the firm's largest shareholder.
The first step is board renewal. The second step is a clearly Paris-aligned plan that meets the science targets, because that will unlock financing at a lower cost of capital.
In a boardroom clear-out, those who've been arguing for months in support of AGL's demerger plans, like Chief Executive Graham Hunt and Chairman Peter Botten, will now leave the company. And so will 2 other high-profile directors, leaving a leadership vacuum and chaos in a 180-year-old business.
It's nothing short of a bloodbath in the boardroom of AGL. But it's been years in the making.
Investment fund Van Eck has a 0.4% stake in AGL and is worried about the energy giant's finances.
The fact that they don't now have financing in place for a single entity is something that the company will have to focus on.
Mike Cannon-Brookes says he's in talks with the company and hasn't ruled out another takeover bid. Rihanna Whitson, ABC News.
Some of the country's most promising Air Force pilots are in Darwin, testing their skills against one another in air warfare training. The top guns will be seen in territory skies for the next month, preparing participants for mid-air conflict in some of the most impressive fighter jets in the fleet. Nabir Khan reports.
Top Gun in the top end.
AWIC is absolutely about training our equivalent of Top Gun graduates here in Australia.
60 aircraft, almost 1,400 pilots and defence personnel, taking exercise Diamond Storm to the skies.
The purpose of AWIC is to grab our high-performing candidates across Air Force from all of our platforms and capabilities. We bring them all together.
It's a showing of military might as tensions rise around the Pacific. But the exercise was always part of the plan.
We're not doing anything different this year that we haven't really done as part of our normal exercise routine.
It marks the start of a noisy few months around the top-end air bases. Darwin residents in for a loud and impressive display of Air Force action.
It is some of the best training area and airspace that we can find anywhere in Australia, and in fact anywhere in the world.
Exercise Diamond Storm will wrap up in late June, but with the well-known international exercise Pitch Black expected later this year, the skies will be busy for some time yet. Nabir Khan, ABC News.
Jai Hindley has become the first Australian to win one of the world's biggest cycling races, Giro d'Italia. The 26-year-old is only the second Australian to ever win a cycling Grand Tour. He joins Tour de France winner Cadel Evans with a finish that's energising Australian cycling. Here's national sports reporter David Mark.
From Australia, Jai Hindley has stepped into history.
It's a beautiful feeling, really. Yeah, a lot of emotions out there today.
Hindley set up the win on Saturday when he attacked the former race leader, Olympic champion Richard Carapaz, to lead by more than a minute. This is the moment for Hindley to be the hero of the Giro. It was down to the final stage time trial to cement the win. He crossed the line just 7 seconds slower than Carapaz to become the first Australian Giro d'Italia winner. Hindley has created history. He's now just the second Australian to win one of cycling's 3 Grand Tours, after Cadel Evans led the way, winning the 2011 Tour de France.
Cadel's first win in the Tour de France was monumental. Jai's win in the Tour of Italy is just as big.
I'm really, really proud to be Australian and, happy to take this one home.
I think it's going to be very, very encouraging for kids who were perhaps looking for someone that they can cheer for at these races and encourage them to get involved in the sport, and that's exactly how Jai Hindley got involved.
Hindley may be an overnight household name, but this win was 20 years in the making, and it began at Western Australia's Midland Cycle Club.
He came out to the velodrome, which is just based outside of Perth near Midland, and this is where it all started.
The future is looking very bright for Australian contenders in the Grand Tours, with Jack Haig third in last year's Tour of Spain and Ben O'Connor, who won a stage and came 4th overall in last year's Tour de France.
I really think it's going to help inspire the next generation of young guys and girls around the country to once again prove that Australians can do anything.
Jai Hindley is due for a break, but this year's Tour of Spain and next year's Tour de France could be the next targets. Tonight, though, he's partying in pink. David Mark, ABC News.
Modern greats Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal will resume their rivalry when they meet in the French Open quarterfinals tomorrow night. Djokovic, the world #1, defeated Argentina's Diego Schwartzman in straight sets. 13-time champion Nadal took almost 4.5 hours to overcome Canadian Felix Auger-Aliassime.
What a way to finish!
Tomorrow, gonna try my best as always. I don't know what can happen, but the only thing that I can guarantee is I'm gonna fight until the end. So many thanks.
In the women's draw, 19-year-old Leylah Fernandez remains on course for a possible semi-final against fellow teenager Coco Gauff after both players won their 4th-round matches. Mexican driver Sergio Perez has taken out the Monaco Formula One Grand Prix for his first win of the season. Charles Leclerc started from pole position but finished 4th and blamed his Ferrari team for making errors during the race. Mick Schumacher crashed heavily on lap 30 but avoided injury. Perez finished in front of Carlos Sainz and Max Verstappen, while Australia's Daniel Ricciardo was 13th. Tens of thousands have gathered in Belgium to watch a rare spectacle. This giant horse is the Bayard steed, who takes part in a once-in-a-decade parade in the usually quiet town of Dendermonde. The horse can weigh up to 1,000 kilograms and is carried by 12 men as it dances its way across the town square. The parade typically acts out the saga of the steed, which can be traced back to the Middle Ages and involves an emperor getting the prized horse in exchange for a peace deal. Sounds like a good plan. Now let's get a check of the weather with another good man. Here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow the coldest air arrives in the nation's southeast. A strong southerly wind dragging up some very cold air from well to the south, and those bunched up isobars mean strong winds from South Australia through New South Wales and up to southeast Queensland. In fact, there are warnings for damaging winds. In the west, a warning of heavy rainfall in the northwest of the Pilbara and far southwest of the Kimberley. So showers in Queensland's southern interior, especially around the Granite Belt, but mostly sunny elsewhere. Windy in Brisbane. In New South Wales, showers mostly along the ranges and also the western slopes, and there will be some snow around above 700 to 800 metres. Windy in Sydney, windy in Canberra, along with some showers. And showers and thunderstorms on and south of the ranges in Victoria. Just a few showers in the north. Snow lowering to 600 metres during the day. Cold, wet and windy in Melbourne. In Tasmania, showers will spread throughout. Snow down to 600 metres elevation. That's in western and central areas. In Hobart, you are in for afternoon showers. Showers over central and eastern parts of South Australia's southern agricultural area. In Adelaide, windy with showers. Showers over the Pilbara, northern and southern goldfields and southern parts of the southwest land division. Also out here in the Euclid, but dry in Perth. And potentially heavy rain expected over the southwest Kimberley, interior and northeastern Gascoyne. In the Territory, possible showers over the Tanami, Lassiter and western Simpson districts, and a possible afternoon storm for Darwin.
Our top stories tonight. 10 Pacific Island nations walk away from a trade and security pact with China. The ABC projects Labor to form a majority government as the coalition opposition elects a new leader. And at least 21 people are dead after a small passenger plane crashes in Nepal. And that is your world for this Monday. I'm Bev O'Connor. I'll see you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.
What's empathy training, and have you ever had it?
No, I haven't, Lee.
Can you please stand back a bit? Thank you.
Wasn't it a serious conflict of interest getting involved in any way in that grand process?
It's not just about whether it's within the rules, it's about the way it looks.
Lifting wages will have an impact.
Yeah, but how do you lift wages?
There are 9 ministers for housing in this country. What are they all doing? 1,000 jobs.
Address the question.
Now is the time to speak.
7:30, Monday to Thursday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
Ready?
Oh, come on, man.
Did you think you were going to be a good mum? I was going to be the best mum.
No.
I felt immediate love.
The room started closing on me.
Everything was wrong.
I had failed as a person.
Sorry. Delusions, paranoia, all of these horrible thoughts.
I felt angry.
I was depressed.
This has nothing to do with love.
You okay?
Sharing their postnatal journeys.
There's no strength in being silent.
You can't ask that. Wednesday on ABC or stream the series on ABC iView.
This is a story 2 decades in the making. In 1999, I was the ABC's Moscow correspondent when a man few Russians had even heard of suddenly came to power.
The inside story of the rise of Putin.
Many fear it marks the beginning of the end of Russian democracy.
A dictator threatening humanity. How much further can Putin go?
Nobody's safe.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Some people search for it, others hide from it, from household names to people who have found themselves in the spotlight. Join me, Courtney Act, on 1+1 as I speak to well-known Australians about what fame means to them.
1+1 with Courtney Act, Thursday 9:35 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
In the final season,
You're the bravest young man I've ever met.
Faith takes on a career-making case.
A 14-year-old boy is giving the doctors full consent to kill him in the tiny hope they might not.
And the past comes back to haunt her.
Faithy, I missed you so much. I want you to leave me!
The thrilling drama. Keeping Faith. Friday on ABC TV. Or log into ABC iView and stream the whole series.
Julian Assange is the hero of our times.
My name is John Shifton. I'm Julian Assange's father.
The maximum sentence of 175 years because he published the truth.
I'm attempting to get Julian out of the shit.
If Julian is extradited,
Free Julian.
he will be the first,
Free the press.
but not the last.
Free us all.
If he goes down, so will journalism.
Ithaca, a fight to free Julian Assange. June 7, ABC TV and ABC iView. Join innovators and trailblazers.
How about this for our first date?
For one final trip down memory lane.
I started choreographing my first work here.
Wow.
This is like where I grew up.
God, it hasn't changed.
Plus, the most emotional homecoming yet.
What a privilege to be part of this.
In Julia Zamiro's very own home delivery.
Oh my goodness. I would have loved to walk through here with him.
Starts Sunday, June 19 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
When I'm 90...
When I'm 90... When I'm 90, I'm still going to laugh a lot.
I want to be like the next Chris Hemsworth.
I can't imagine myself in a flannel with my pants all the way up to here. It's not me.
It would be really sad if we weren't together when we're 90. I hope... Actually, maybe you need to change your diet.
Can I say something?
Okay.
I would get people to do all my work.
She's really going to be sexy when she turns 90.
Yeah.
I would love to have at least 78 grandchildren.
You know, when we go to the beach and we always point out the grandmas that are still in their little bikinis and they're going for a swim and we're like, yeah, you go, girls. You've got goals.
Happy birthday, ABC.
Yours for 90 years.
Good evening, Yvonne Yong with the top stories on ABC News. Labor will govern in its own right after securing a majority in the House of Representatives. The ABC projects the party has retained the Melbourne seat of Macnamara. It means it will hold at least 76 seats in the lower house, the bare minimum for majority government, and won't need to rely on crossbencher support. The Melbourne seat of Deakin and Gilmore on the New South Wales South Coast still remain in doubt. Fresh leadership for the federal coalition in opposition. Peter Dutton has become the new leader of the Liberal Party. After being elected unopposed, Susan Lee is his deputy, while David Littleproud will lead the National Party after beating Barnaby Joyce and Darren Chester in their party room contest today. And Pacific Island nations have walked away from a proposed region-wide trade and security deal with China. The deal, which was leaked last week, aimed to reshape regional order and expand cooperation in areas like policing, trade and development. While China said there was general support for the proposal, Pacific leaders had concerns, with Fiji's Prime Minister, Frank Bainimarama, calling on Beijing to make stronger climate commitments domestically. Those are the latest stories. Stay with us on ABC News.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, after a drubbing at the polls, the coalition ushers in a new era of leadership under Peter Dutton and David Littleproud. Mike Cannon-Brooks, Victoria, says Australia's biggest emitter, AGL, abandons its plan to de-merge. We explain. And as China's diplomatic push in the Pacific hits a hurdle, we'll hear from a former regional leader about what Australia needs to do to win over local leaders. Joining me on the panel tonight, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin. Great to see you. Thank you. Political and international editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Harcher. Thanks for coming in.
Pleasure, Wendy. You're Ellen, you're Wendy. Sorry.
Yes, we'll keep it that way.
I'll straighten it out.
Yeah. President of the Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson and City of Sydney Councillor, Imelda Davis. Busy day. Thanks for making time, Imelda. All right. And in Canberra tonight, Research Fellow and Director of the Pacific Institute at the ANU, George Carter. G'day, George. Wonderful to see you. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. The new federal leadership of the coalition has taken shape today, with the Liberal and National Party rooms voting this morning in Canberra. Peter Dutton was elected unopposed as the Liberal Party's new leader, with former Environment Minister Susan Lee appointed deputy. And following their electoral defeat last week, the new leader of the opposition has set a clear direction for his party.
We won't be Labor light. We'll propose strong policy to make the lives of Australians better and to provide more security to them. Our policies will be squarely aimed at the forgotten Australians in the suburbs across regional Australia, the families and small businesses whose lot the Labor Party will have made more difficult. Under my leadership, the Liberal Party will be true to our values that have seen us win successive elections over the course of the last quarter of a century.
However, the new deputy leader did seek to address some of the criticism the party has faced when it comes to women voters.
I will continue to be a strong voice for women. We know that we didn't receive the support of all women at the last election. And my message to the women of Australia is, we hear you, we heard you. We're listening, we're talking. And we are determined to earn back your trust and your faith.
Meanwhile, the Nationals chose not to re-elect former leader Barnaby Joyce. The party room instead chose Queensland MP David Littleproud and first-term Senator Perrin Davey as deputy.
And this is not about the National Party lurching left or lurching right. It's using common sense and being in the sensible centre. That's where you win elections, not chasing extremities. And the National Party proved that when we signed up to net zero by 2050. And if we didn't sign up to that, let me just say, every Australian, Treasury modelling would have shown that capital markets had already factored in nearly up to a 3% increase in your mortgages, and your commodity prices would have gone down. So I couldn't look my people in the eye and say we can't be part of a global community.
And while rejection might hurt for some, the outgoing Nationals leader insists he's taking it all in his stride.
Well, I suppose you think I'm sad. Not really. I gave every ounce of my energy to make sure I looked after the people of regional Australia, the people in the small family businesses, the people in the weatherboard 9, those people on the farms, making sure that we drove the investments to hopefully take their standard of living ahead.
Imelda, let's start with you. This program has a Pacific flavour to it. Your family has a long history in Australia as well. When you think of Peter Dutton, often people in the Pacific talk about his unfortunate joke about rising sea levels. How well remembered is that?
Thanks so much, Ellen. And you know, this is very well remembered because it's a continuum of the, I guess, the amnesia that Australia has when it comes to a Pacific slave trade that occurred here in the 1800s. And to think that our people are still suffering some 175 years later in relation to, I guess, being the forgotten people of this nation, and now our Pacific Island homes are challenged with climate change. So that comment that Peter made some years ago still sits quite firmly in our psyche.
Mm. And to what extent, George, members of the Pacific community, you are here in Australia, you call Tonga home as well, looking to see how genuine all political parties in Australia are about the challenge of real action on climate change?
Thank you very much. I just wanted to start that my home is actually Samoa.
So apologies.
No. No. You know, first, you know, the comments, I still recall this back in 2015. I think it was post-Pacific Island Forum where Dutton made the speech. And, you know, it has been replayed over in media and social media. And it really was one of those cases that epitomizes the last government. Looking forward to the new government here in Australia, especially with now Labor and what Penny Wong calls the new era of engagement in the Pacific. Many are looking to not only how Labor will bring together not only a consensus or crossing the line for greater climate action, but also what both national and the coalition policies will be in terms of climate change. Will there be a change to bring about this climate action?
And it was interesting, Wendy, to hear David Littleproud speaking so very clearly after, of course, Matt Canavan famously said, the LNP senator during the election campaign, that net zero was dead. And a moderate Liberal MP today who lost his seat, Trent Zimmerman, said that was a killer moment for moderate Liberals. How difficult is it going to be for him to maintain that line that this is where the Nationals are on this? Because the federal Nationals have been so far behind where you New South Wales Nationals.
Well, certainly New South Wales and the state coalition are making great gains, as are all the states. They're actually, you know, doing really well and in many states ahead of the targets that they'd set some years ago. So they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting at the state level, which is helping the nation. I think that David sent some clear signals today in terms of what he said and how he said it and who he had with him about perhaps a bit of a generational change in the National Party. And you see a couple of younger leaders there coming out to lead the party at the federal level, talking about climate change. David has done that for some time, and he referred in his press conference to the initiatives that he rolled out in terms of incentives for farmers to get involved in carbon storage, carbon farming. And that was, a world first done by the Nats, as he said. So it's quite a broad church. When people often mistake the National Party and think they're all like the loudest mouths, they're not. And Matt Canavan probably is one of the louder voices, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily the most representative voice. And when he said that in the federal election, a lot of people went, oh no. It wasn't helpful in an election campaign, and we saw the impact of that in the city, in those seats like North Sydney, where I was handing out on election day, and climate was really the topic of the day. So I think, the task for David and his leadership team is probably a bit of a policy reset. That's not taking a long way from where it was. I think it's probably articulating better what the Nats' position is and how we're going to take that forward and where the opportunities are there.
Well, and I think the moderate Liberals have reflected that Australians just didn't think the National Party was fair dinkum. I mean, when Canavan came out and said net zero is dead, they went, aha, that's what's really going on. They've signed up to it, but they don't really believe it. I mean, I guess that's the task for him. But at the same time, he's saying, Peter, there should be action on climate change, and he's left no doubt about that. But at the same time, he says, yeah, but the government doesn't have a role in delivering that, which will be news to the National Farmers Federation. And then you look over at Peter Dutton, who's the leader of the Liberal Party, and he says, oh, we're estranged from big business. The CEOs are closer to other parties. So you've got the head of the Nats out of the step with the National Farmers Federation, the head of the Libs out of step with big business. Have we fallen down a rabbit hole?
Well, if it's a rabbit hole, it's one that they've been in, the coalition's been in for years, and, both some of the Nats and some of the Liberals are quite comfortable in that rabbit hole. In an alternative reality, it's a fantasy about the state of the planet, and it's a fantasy about where most of Australia is. However, some seats, and this is the critical part, some seats, particularly in Queensland, these guys still see climate and coal as their differentiating political persona and won't readily abandon it. Matt Canavan is not going to stop advocating for coal. Barnaby Joyce, who agrees with Matt Canavan, in fact Canavan is an understudy of Barnaby's, Barnaby will now be liberated to talk about this because he's no longer leader, if he wishes to. They think it's worked for them, regardless of what's happened in the rest of Australia.
Yet Michelle Landry, who's a Queenslander, was, when she arrived in Canberra this week, saying, we've got to start talking about this. We've got to get, on board. We've got to have policies that represent broader Australia. So, she's a Queenslander and she's saying we've got to acknowledge climate change and do something about it. So, that's to my point that there are some quite loud, outspoken voices in the National Party, but it doesn't always mean they are the majority view. It's challenging.
Just finally to Imelda on this, I know that you do work with First Nations Australians constituents as well. Peter Dutton said he had regrets today, that it was a mistake to walk out of the Parliament when Kevin Rudd was making an apology to the stolen generations, that's First Nations children taken from their parents, on the basis that at the time he thought, unless all the injustices and all the inequalities are dealt with, it's just symbolic. What do you make of that?
Look, I think Dutton has made quite a few mistakes over the years, and I hope he's, all I can say is that I hope he's reflecting on these actions because they send a loud and clear message, and that was evident in our election.
Tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes has pulled off a corporate coup, which he says will help propel Australia to its goal of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050. He has stopped AGL Energy, which is the nation's biggest carbon polluter, from splitting into two separate companies. Now, the company's management decided last year that creating these two separate companies to focus on moving away from coal-fired power generation and into renewables was the way to go. But Mike Cannon-Brookes argued that keeping the company as one unit would make the transition quicker and easier. The Drum's David Taylor explains.
AGL Energy powers millions of homes across the country, providing gas and electricity. For decades, it's done that by burning coal at one of its many power stations. But But it's also meant it's achieved the status of becoming Australia's biggest fossil fuels emitter and the single largest contributor to carbon emissions. It's widely understood the solution to that problem is closing the coal-fired power stations and instead using renewable energy like wind farms to generate the power to produce electricity. The question is, how do you go about that? In March last year, the board of directors decided to split the company in two. Accel Energy to work on the renewable transition and squeezing every last cent out of AGL's remaining power stations, and AGL Australia to focus on the retail and power supply arm. Tech billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes disagreed with that idea, believing the company's transfer to renewable power generation would be faster if it stayed in one piece.
The new government with the Labor Party's plans makes the demerger maths very hard to see how it makes any sense. We would argue it didn't make a lot of sense anyway in the first place. I know the company can do the maths the same way we can.
His first move was just to try to take over the whole company by buying it, so he could call the shots. He first tried this in February, but was rejected. He tried again in March, upping his offer, but was rejected again. Then he decided to spend $654 million buying an 11.28% stake in the company, and in the process becoming its biggest shareholder. That gave him a platform to convince other shareholders to vote against the board of directors' plan to split the company in two, which today he achieved.
We're doing the things that we said we were going to go do. We've said what we're going to do for 3 weeks, and every single time we've done what we said, so we'll continue to do that.
It's also led to the departure of AGL's chief executive, Graham Hunt, and chairman Peter Button will leave the company.
For more on this, we're joined by Global Head of Strategy at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Kobad Bhavnagri. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
This has been a fascinating kind of corporate soap opera, hasn't it, Kobad? Start at the beginning. Just really start at the beginning for us, because Audi comes on his white horse, or maybe it's a black horse, depending on your point of view, and says, right, AGL, 8% of Australians' emissions, that's more than every single car on the road, more than all our domestic and international aviation, and we're going to get AGL to end coal-fired power generation in basically a decade. So this was a bold ambition that he had.
Yes, I mean, it is a bold ambition. And if we sort of wind this back to, okay, how did it start? We have to go back a fair bit. We have to really go back to sort of 2010 and the early part of the 2010s, when AGL went on a bit of a buying spree. It started to buy a lot of coal generators, which were being sold for a song by state governments in New South Wales, and also acquired a big one down in Victoria. And that really transformed the company from being not much of an electricity generator, having a little bit, but not a huge footprint, to being the biggest electricity generator in Australia, and therefore also Australia's biggest carbon emitter. And bringing those big coal-fired power stations on board changed the company, and was, many would argue, a pretty short-sighted move. I mean, it worked well for a couple of years when electricity market prices were rising. AGL obviously reaped the benefits of having a big portfolio of generators in there. But at around 2017 came a turning point where the electricity market price started to come down because of all these renewables coming into the system, which put downward pressure on prices. And that coincided, of course, with the Paris Climate Agreement, where the world and financiers really started to take climate change seriously, and so began to question the value and see a terminal date to those coal-fired power stations. It really started to sort of turn sour for AGL, and their share price for the last 5 years has sort of been in terminal decline almost. It has dropped 70% since its peak in 2017, and then it was last year, as it was outlined in David Taylor's package, that the board said, okay, we've got to do something about this, and then they announced this demerger plan.
Okay, and so just really briefly from me, Kobad, the tension was between Cannon Brooks and other big capital organisations on his side saying we need a faster shift away from coal-fired power. I mean, that was their big push. And the company's saying, look, we'll split it in half and that'll be the way to get us to renewables. But it was seen as actually trying to wring every last dollar out of fossil fuels in this country. Is it fair to say that as of tonight, Cannon Brooks won and the company lost?
Well, I would put it as Cannon Brooks won and the current management of the company lost. So I think the way that certainly Cannon Brooks and some other players have interpreted what AGL's strategy in splitting their company was definitely as trying to maximise the value of those coal generators, but also not really position itself for the future. Right? And this is sort of one of the core problems that companies face in the energy transition, is that it's hard to have an eye to the future if you've still got one eye on the past, right? So if you've got these big fossil fuel assets, it's hard to start to build a different business which often runs counter to those interests to position the company for the future. Yeah. And AGL we're struggling with that, as many companies around the world have too. And the demerger plan was basically a bit of financial engineering, where they were saying, okay, we recognise we've got a problem with these coal-fired power stations, so we're going to spin them out, but we're going to contract with that spin-off company to agree to buy all the power for 5 years. Yeah. So we're not really like, are we getting rid of them? Well, yes maybe and no. Yes, so it was a bit of optics, really. Yeah. It was a bit of financial optics and engineering, which meant that, the conviction to really transform and become a new energy company wasn't, arguably wasn't there.
Let me turn to George Carter on this. I mean, you do a lot of work on how this sort of diplomacy happens, how the art of persuasion happens. What do you think of Cannon Brooks saying, righto, who's the biggest emitter in Australia? Let's go there. Let's go there.
Yeah, so my research, when I look into climate change negotiations, I follow sort of the work of Pacific negotiators, but where I find in there are what you know as climate champions. So when Paris came about, champions like Inele Sopoanga and other leaders like Tony de Bruym sort of set forth in creating or influencing other leaders to have the Paris Agreement, a voluntary system. That it wasn't just about states providing a wholesale signal that there must be change, but it called upon businesses, civil society, to not only set targets, but create about urgent change. Now, this is an example of a climate champion, through a business a millionaire that is able to force or accelerate change, not only in Australian business, but it's sending signals right across in terms of supply chain and renewable energy. And it's an action that should be applauded, that climate champions are not just diplomatic leaders, politicians or activists, but also business leaders.
And in the end, Wendy, I mean, they couldn't get 75% of the shareholders to agree with the AGL board and management's prescription on how to move forward. And a big part of that was the industry super fund HESTA, who represent health and community service workers. And that's the employers and the unions and independent directors together saying, we invest for the long-term interests of our members, and that interest is best served by decarbonisation.
Yeah, they are a reasonable sized shareholder. I come in at 3% or something like that. I mean, I think the issue is really interesting in a number of ways. It's an interesting one from sort of corporate governance, strategy, and how you get from here to there. Plus the bigger problem of how do you transition from the old-fashioned power, coal-fired power, to new power, maintain jobs, maintain shareholder value, because it has shareholders. So I guess one of the things they've had an eye to is returns to shareholders, who presumably they are super fund members. So they want a good return on their money, but at the same time they've got to change the business, remarkably, to try and deliver the carbon outcome that people are after. So it's really complex. And you throw a billionaire into the mix who's articulate, charismatic, wealthy, and yeah, he's had a big victory today.
It's a big fight, Imelda, too, over how quickly you think this transition is really going to happen.
Look, I think there's a lot of young, innovative leaders coming through, and what I do love about Mike Brooks is that he's, the climate activist. So, it's always important to agitate industries and just see, what surfaces. So, I think it's going to be really progressive and effective in moving forward.
And Peter, he seems to think, this is a guy who knows how to make money. He's a billionaire. He seems to think that he can very rapidly, that if he was able to take over the company, which he didn't succeed, but he succeeded today, that it's really possible to build enormous amounts of renewable energy to replace coal-fired power quite quickly, like within the decade. He seems to think that that is doable. That's his business brain.
Well, he's got experience, so he's not only a software entrepreneur. Among his other interests is this thing called Sun Cable, which has built, or is building, the world's biggest solar farm in the Northern Territory, and then via cable sending the electricity from that to Singapore. It's going to supply 15% of Singapore's annual electricity needs. It's a $20 billion plus project that they're currently building. So he's already doing it. He's part of that investment. He knows it can be done. Other countries have already done it and are doing it. It's eminently doable. What he's doing is just taking a company that, well, we were talking before about the coalition. The coalition government made a short-term bet under Tony Abbott and Barnaby Joyce that coal was the future, and the rest of the party was mistaken in thinking that was a long-term play. It wasn't. AGL, wrong side of history, same deal. They thought it was a permanent fixture. It's not. It's a temporary thing, and now they're having trouble making the transition, and Mike Cannon-Brookes is going to line up and help them with it.
So how much control has he got, Cobat? I mean, he did want to take over and privatise the whole company. He hasn't succeeded in that. But the chair, the managing director and another 2 members of the board have walked out today, and the Australian Financial Review's, but they're basically throwing their hands up saying, OK, somebody figure out what's next. Can he dictate the pace of the decarbonisation effort?
Yeah, so look, I think Mike Cannon-Brookes has won the argument, and I would stress that the argument was not won on environmental grounds, it was one on business grounds. So if you look at the campaign that Mike Cannon-Brookes waged, it was very much about finance, corporate strategy and performance. It was saying that, look, this is a company which has leadership which doesn't get it, which is not forward-leaning, which is stuck in the past and is making bad decisions. And look, that argument has won the day in this circumstance. The bar was lower because he only needed to get 25% of the vote, but he's won that argument. And so I think that's really a powerful indicator that whoever is formulating AGL's new strategy now, of which Cannon-Brookes will have influence on, but won't be dictating, that they're really going to have to, adopt a similar posture to say, okay, no, we've got to lean into the energy transition. We've got to figure out, okay, how do we provide our customers with as much renewable energy as possible, and how do we solve the problems that they will have in a new energy age, which are things like, hey, I've got solar on my roof, but how do I get a battery in there, and how do I get an electric vehicle in the garage, and who's going to install the plug for it, and all this stuff. There's a whole bunch of business opportunities in the energy transition for the whole economy, but let alone an energy retailer. And Mike Cannon-Brookes' argument was that, hey, you've got to go for that. And that argument has won. And I think it will be pretty tough for new management of AGL to come around and say, oh, actually, no, we still want to go slow on that. Because frankly, AGL have been, sort of wishy-washy, haven't had a clear strategy on energy transition for the last decade. They've tried a bunch of things, stopped them, etc. And their share price has been hammered. The market doesn't like it.
Yeah. Fascinating to see. Fascinating corporate play. Cannon-Brookes has described it as one of the biggest decarbonisation projects on earth. Imelda, you wanted to have a final word?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just, and I'd be also interested to see just how effective these organisations are working with, Aboriginal carbon foundations and Indigenous perspectives on, eliminating these emissions and putting forward these, building sustainability as well in collaboration with First Nations communities.
Because sustainability is more than just decarbonisation, is the point, yeah?
That's right.
Kobad Bhavnagi, thanks so very much for your time. He's the Global Head of Strategy at Bloomberg New Energy Finance. You are watching The Drum, and with me on the panel, Vice Chair of the New South Wales National Party, Wendy Machin, Political and International Editor at the Sydney Morning Herald, Peter Hatcher, President of Australian South Sea Islanders, Port Jackson and City of Sydney Councillor Imelda Davis, and in Canberra tonight, Research Fellow and Director of the Pacific Institute at ANU, George Carter. China's efforts to strike a region-wide trade and security pact with Pacific Island leaders hit a hurdle today, with leaders refusing to sign up to the deal. A crucial meeting between China's Foreign Minister and a number of his Pacific Island counterparts took place earlier today in Fiji. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi arrived in the country yesterday after visiting the Solomon Islands, Kiribati and Samoa as part of an 8-country tour. The proposed deal included Chinese and Pacific cooperation on policing, cybersecurity, fisheries and disaster relief. But the Fijian Prime Minister says global uncertainty led him to oppose the pact.
Geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas. Climate impacts have intensified, and Russia's war in Ukraine has sent food, fuel and freight prices skyrocketing. We cannot retreat from the field of multilateralism in the face of these multiple crises. Indeed, global cooperation and international law have never mattered more.
And it was the issue of climate change that overshadowed much of the visit by Australia's new Foreign Minister to Fiji last week. After meeting with Penny Wong over the weekend, Fiji's Prime Minister tweeted this.
Fiji is not in anyone's backyard. We are part of a Pacific family, and our greatest concern isn't geopolitics, it's climate change. In that spirit, I had a wonderful meeting with Foreign Minister Senator Wong to strengthen our Vivale partnership with Australia.
Let's start with you, George. How are you reading this? Like, it's tempting to say, OK, China went all out to get this agreement, and this group of Pacific Island nations said no thanks, and Penny Wong's gone in there and it looks pretty good. The problem with Beijing resolved. Is that how you read it?
Not necessarily. It's important to put into context what has happened in the last couple of weeks, well, especially the last week, in terms of China visiting, Foreign Minister visiting the 8 countries. In a way, he's showing his respect by visiting these 8 countries. There wasn't necessarily anything new, rather a reaffirmation of policies or initiatives that were agreed to before COVID. The optics here, though, is that you have a foreign minister visiting a country like Kiribati that's still under COVID lockdown, a foreign minister visiting the first ever female prime minister of Samoa, and in fact this is the first ever international leader that they've met face to face. So in a way, China is not only reaffirming its economic, diplomatic ties, but also showing that respect. However, when it came to the area of trying to form some form of regional or multilateral agreement, this is where it missed out. While it's been a great opportunity for Pacific countries to show their, reflect and sort of tell forth their key messages, which are climate change, COVID, it's important that China needs to also understand the Pacific way of doing things. Part of that is inclusivity, consensus, transparency, especially in the case of media. So it's also good lessons for China, but it certainly will not be the last.
That's a fascinating perspective. What do you think, Peter, particularly that talk of consensus? There seemed to be a vibe coming out of Suva today that some countries wanted to have a look at that sweeping regional economic and security deal, but others didn't. And as George says, where there's no consensus, they just hit the brakes a little bit and slow down.
Well, it's divisive. The relations with China have now thrown a new level of division into the politics internally in a bunch of Pacific countries, and now you see it at the leaders level between countries as well, where some leaders are more keen to get involved at a deeper level with China than others. But look, whatever has happened today, in fact, Ellen, I talked to Penny Wong this morning. I wanted to hear what her experience was last week, where she visited the Pacific 4 days into the life of the new government, in fact. She said that whatever was going to happen today with Wang Yi and the Pacific leaders, that she said we can expect China will press its interests in the Pacific harder than ever, and that Australia needs to compete. Australia, to quote her, Australia has our work cut out for it.
And to what extent was she holding her breath about this meeting with Wang Yi getting together in Suva with all these regional leaders to sit down and say, look, do you want money and engagement on security, on policing, on maritime, on cyber security, on training your police, on fisheries? To what extent was there not alarm, but real concern in Australia that this was a key moment?
Well, I think I'd make 2 points. From what Penny Wong said to me this morning, she said she found a good reception in the Pacific, that leaders were pleased, enthusiastic to have a government with a more active climate policy and pleased to have the more active engagement. The previous Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, in 3 years had only made 2 trips into the Pacific and visited only 3 countries. It was COVID constrained, but it wasn't much of an effort. Penny Wong said she found an enthusiastic reception, so she was feeling pretty good about her initial foray, and she'll be back again, as will Anthony Albanese, with the Pacific Islands Forum leaders meeting in July. But I don't think she has any illusions about the scale of the problem and scale of the challenge from China. It's 8 years since Xi Jinping flew into the region, flew into Fiji, and said, you know, we are going to bring, I think he said, we're going to offer you a ride on the development freight train, express train of China, and we're here, and we're going to make a big push, and that push remains. It's a key strategic priority for China, and whatever obstacles they hit, as they've hit today, they'll work around them, they'll work over them, they'll work through them and beyond them.
Imelda, what perhaps do you think that Beijing understands about the region that Australia doesn't, or has forgotten, or never did?
Oh, look, I really do think that with China being of, I guess, deep cultural understanding in, you know, how you approach and respect other cultures. I think, you know, Solomons, Vanuatu, so on, you know, we have a deep appreciation for customary practice and cultural governance, and political diplomacy is really important for Pacific nations especially, and you see in the manner in which many leaders and heads of mission that I've worked with in the past conduct themselves, incredibly gracious. So I wouldn't underestimate what's just occurred. I think Penny is the perfect diplomat to head up these negotiations, but don't underestimate the savvy of our Pacific nations. So, and, you know, Australia has a long history, and I think Australia tends to forget we have a long history. Australia and Vanuatu in particular, as Australian South Sea Islanders, are the largest Vanuatu diaspora in this country. And if we are truly talking about Pacific neighbours, Pacific Step Up, you know, a number of other initiatives that have been rolled out in previous years, you know, there's still not a strong foundation. We need to have a more grassroots people at the table to speak through these issues from a lived experience. You need to work with the people, as the Australian people have, you know, demonstrated in this recent election. If you're going to overstep or forget the people, you're not going to get, you know, progress in a country. So I think it's really important that we take heed of what's occurring right now in the political climate and empower the people, and don't underestimate the power of the people. So, yeah, it's you know, we've got issues with Pacific labour mobility, etc. And we've worked for the last decade in remedying some of those challenges, but still there's a great lack of understanding around the cultural necessary framework in speaking to each other, and respect for memorandums of understanding, and making sure that we build capacity for both countries. It's not just a one-way street here. and people are reaching out to support, people's economies. So what's Australia really going to do? We need affirmative action.
Yeah, that word respect keeps coming up again and again, George, respect and listening. There's a kind of a feeling that goes, well, when Nui has a cyclone, when Vanuatu has a cyclone, Australians are there. As if China has just arrived this minute in the Pacific and turned up. Now, you yourself have some Chinese heritage. These links with China go way, way back. Describe that and tell me about the influence of that.
Yes, so in terms of Chinese populations within the Pacific, you have sort of third and fourth generation who are not only children or descendants of those who came as indentured laborers during the colonial plantations in the 1800s and 1900s, but also explorers during those times. And these populations have assimilated and joined the rest of the local societies. But then more recent in terms of with the increase in economic activity from China, you have a new wave of Chinese migrants who are not only small, medium enterprise business owners, they're also part and parcel of the construction companies that are, who are fulfilling some of these infrastructure programs by China and the rest of the Pacific. They have had a struggle in terms of living amongst societies within the Pacific and have been, in some places, sources of tension. Part of this is not understanding cultural differences. But, this is a reality and dynamic of Pacific society today.
Fascinating. An important moment.
Can I just add?
Yes, indeed.
Sorry.
Go on.
Sorry, but yeah, and I do agree, George, and it's also a reality of Australian government. I mean, the challenges we have with First Nations Australians, we've got issues around climate change for the Torres Strait as we speak, still considered a part of our Pacific or Melanesian regions. So we've got to start unpacking some of this and really having people who have the knowledge, the know-how, and the consistent understanding, because every time a government changes, we have to go out and re-educate. And this is the downfall. And that's why you get these issues surfacing all the time, because of the lack of trust that's built between, the countries.
Yeah. Well, an important moment in Australia's relations in the region came at the Pacific Islands Forum held in Tuvalu back in 2019. Climate change was at the top of the agenda, but during negotiations on the forum's communique, a blueprint used for policy making in the region, the Australian delegation was reported to have pushed to remove any references to coal or a strategy for net zero by 2050. Now, the eventual communique, which was passed, did call for an immediate global ban on the construction of new coal-fired power plants and coal mines, but with the qualification that not all countries supported it. After the meeting, many Pacific leaders spoke of their disappointment with Australia. Among them was the host and chair of the meeting, Tuvalu's Prime Minister, Enele Sopawanga, who said he was stunned by Scott Morrison's behaviour. He's now no longer the Prime Minister, but he told me earlier of the need to reset the relationship and suggested that Australia's new Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, should have travelled more widely on her first trip to the Pacific region.
We are not the backdoor backyard of Australia, with all due respect. Pacific Island nations are independent sovereign countries. They are in the United Nations. And I think this needs to be translated into proper, respectful engagement with island nations. Visiting one country will not fix the problem. In fact, it will further create some sort of feelings amongst the other Pacific Island countries.
You've described Beijing's efforts to increase its presence in the Pacific region by saying the camel is already in the tent. What do you mean by that? 10
years ago, we didn't have that because our partnership with Australia was strong. Australia and Pacific Island countries, including my own, were engaged in tangible economic and social development projects, and they are visible in the island nations. The visibility of Australia was there. There was a lapse and suddenly an absence of that partnerships of concrete physical presence of Australia in Tuvalu and many other countries. And I think that's when we allowed an opportunity for the Camel, to put its influence, and in came big interventions by China in the Pacific, as well as trying to put its nose in the Pacific Island Leaders Forum. And now I think the 2 feet of the camel are already in.
Sure, but Beijing doesn't have a great record on climate change itself. How much is this actually about money?
It's not a secret that there is a checkbook diplomacy ongoing, but also at the same time, the island countries, particularly the most vulnerable island countries, have been calling out that the main security issue is climate change. We are already seeing the tug of war. It's no longer a Cold War. We are entering already, I think, a hot war now. With these island countries, 14 votes in the United Nations can be swayed and persuaded to take up positions that may be quite adverse and counter-effective to Pacific stability and peace in our region in the Pacific.
What does Australia do now, not just in terms of emissions reductions, but in relation to providing funds for adaptation for small island states through the Green Climate Fund?
It was a great slap on the face when Australia decided to move out of the GCF, simply following President Trump's attitude and policy, I believe. That was a great slap on the face of Pacific Island countries. We were, in fact, very, very disappointed. But at the same time, maintain not honoring its greenhouse gas emission reductions targets, not to allow temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. I think the voices of the Pacific on these things have been very, very clear.
Pacific Island nations have been lobbying for years now for Australia to stop opening new and expanded coal mines and new coal-fired power stations. Now, as of last year, we have 72 such projects, which would double our coal and gas production on one estimate. How much harder does that make it to reset the relationship?
The thing is this, the more coal mining and greens that would create greenhouse gas emissions, the more we in the islands have to adapt to the impacts of climate change. We just have to keep that equation in mind. We cannot say, all right, we give the Pacific Island countries $2.7 billion, while domestically in Australia, policies are to open more coal mining. Australia, I encourage them to seriously look at what needs to be done in reducing its domestic greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, former Tuvalu Prime Minister there, Anale Sopawanga. Wendy, truth time. Australia, under the coalition, I guess, has dropped the ball on the Pacific.
I think that's probably not unreasonable. They are important nations. Every now and again, you see island nations where people are now becoming refugees because the water is taking away their homes. And regrettably, I don't think we've seen enough of that. It's shocking when you do see it, but we probably haven't seen enough of that. They are important neighbours to us. They are important relationships, and I guess we are copying some justifiable criticism from those nations. And we are seeing others come in and occupy the space. And even the nations in question can realise the risks potentially associated with that. So I think it's going to be an interesting few years, I guess, in diplomatic relations between those nations.
Well, I suppose it was at the time that Tony Abbott cut foreign aid, Scott Morrison decided not to make any further contributions to the Green Climate Fund, which was created to support the efforts of developing countries to respond to the challenge of climate change. I mean, at least some Australians must have said to themselves, well, good, spend money here. Thinking about national security and our role in the region, is that thinking a mistake now?
So you mean
drive
spend
down
money,
foreign aid.
spend money here,
Spend money in Australia, not overseas.
Oh, in Australia.
You know?
Oh, look, I don't think it's not about not spending. I mean, we do spend money overseas,
But that was cut.
varies.
That was cut very significantly, right?
You know, it's not correct to say we don't spend it, and I guess it's a government's right to decide how and when they'll spend it. So it'll be interesting to see what the new government does in that space. I think we do all have a responsibility to provide support. You know, whether that's in aid for green type projects or more general infrastructure. Yes, I think that's the role of every country. I guess where some of the resistance comes from, and it is probably partly domestic politics again, there's this interesting interplay between domestic and international politics, and it's almost impossible to untangle them when you talk about climate change. I suppose some people would argue that Australia by itself, if we stop building any power stations, any new gas projects, what impact does that have on the world? It's quite small. So I guess that's where some people say, well, okay, well, you know, this is just the perception. We take a big hit, we lose jobs, or we have to, you know, invest in transitioning. We're not quite sure how we're going to do that and how successful it might be, but we need to do it. But what is the global impact of that? And it's really small because as a nation, we're a very small emitter.
Imelda, what do you think hearing that?
I just go back to the same mantra in that we have a relationship with the Pacific. You know, these are our neighbours, these are our families. We cannot ignore what's happening here. If we are a smaller emitter, who's creating those largest emissions, and why? Because we're importing the products from those countries. So, you know, it's very challenging, but you know, we need to build better people-to-people relationships. Otherwise, we're going to have a disaster on our hands.
And just to Wendy's point, right, about we don't hear enough about it. I was doing some research on Vanuatu, and I think I have his name right, Ralph Regenvanu, right, who used to be the foreign minister, now he's the opposition leader, speaks very powerfully on this and says, look, I think what you don't understand in Australia is that Vanuatu is in a permanent state of emergency. Cyclone Pam comes through, not only are people killed and the population displaced, but 90% of the buildings are wiped out. And then 5 years later, another cyclone comes through and you end up with poverty traps, kids who never go back to school. Just take the time to explain to me what it means to be in a permanent state of climate emergency, which Vanuatu is in now.
Well, it's constant trauma, isn't it? It's devastation. And then you've got, you know, programs that are, you know, needing the men from Vanuatu to pick our fruit. And that's not addressing climate change. It's adding to the challenges that we're facing because people don't even have a moment because they're trying to rebuild their communities and they're taken advantage of in some ways, in many ways, because you know, they have to go out and try and recreate a whole lifestyle that they've lost, you know, and it's quite distressing. With Cyclone Pam and Cyclone Winston, we, SCPJ, our organisation, assisted and the Australian community in providing a significant amount of national disaster resources, but we can't keep contributing to that capacity because it's just, you know, everyone's depleted. And the communities are really suffering, you know, and there's no real capacity building and supporting these Pacific Island nations in rebuilding, you know, and we need affirmative action. We need the support and the injection of financial support. It's not just about, you know, you've got to cut out, I think, the middleman. It's got to be a government-to-government program and discussion because you've got all these agencies that are going in there and you're paying for the administration just to keep them, you know, afloat over there in those economies. So, you know, there's got to be smarter ways of working, but the only way you're going to resolve that is if you work with the people and the organisations. Yes, we have, you know, our government representatives of the highest order, but lived experience and what's going on for the people, by the people, is going to be the solution for the people.
Talk to the same point, George. Ralph Regenvanu talks about poverty traps, the idea of that one cyclone comes through, it wipes out the schools, some kids never go to school again, it wipes out the fields and the impact on subsistence agriculture, particularly for women. Talk to me about what it means.
First, I want to sort of start and say that Australia and the Pacific Islands share the same geography, so same climatic system, but the impacts are different and also the extent of these disasters. So, you have impacts like cyclones. We do have cyclone season every year. What we're seeing more and more, and what the science is saying, is more intense Category 5 cyclones. We're seeing more flooding as well as ocean acidification. So what is happening right now is countries like Vanuatu, Fiji, Solomon Islands, Tonga are not only facing Category 5 cyclones once every 10 years, it's almost 2 or 3 a year. And we've seen in Vanuatu probably 1 every year. This causes a lot of stress on communities who have to rebuild. There's displacement that happens every time there's a cyclone, migration within, from areas that were impacted out and then moving back in. There's water salination, water insecurity because of sea level rise in places like Marshall Islands as well as Tuvalu.
And you're talking there about freshwater. Limitations on freshwater because the sea level table is rising and contaminating the fresh water.
That's correct. And so there are various different impacts all across the Pacific, and it's getting more and more intense and causes stress on local communities. Furthermore, for governments, having to seek out funding to try and rebuild, this goes to the generosity of countries like Australia, China, United States in providing humanitarian assistance. But then at the same time, countries like Tuvalu will then have to, or Vanuatu would have to ask for more debt, for more loans to rebuild. And if you're having costs like around $200 million or $300 million every year, this is a stress on the economy itself. And so it's not just individuals or communities, but statewide. And so this is why countries like Vanuatu, Marshall Islands have called for climate emergency. We've seen it in the Kainaki 2 and Nandi Bay Declaration. The region are calling for, we are in climate crisis. So it's not just a rhetoric. It's as Wanda was saying, it's a lived reality. And it's something that it's not just something that Australia, but globally that we should all be looking at and trying to address together.
It's amazing, Peter, to think that, that Ralph can say of Vanuatu, and this a couple of years ago, look, they can actually price in the cost of the devastation of climate change to their annual budget at US $48 million. And as Wendy was indicating just then to me, it suddenly makes some sense that if China turns up with deep pockets, you go, well, hello. And at the same time, Albanese has said coal exports could go beyond 2050. He will not oppose the opening of new coal mines, and nobody's talking about the Green Climate Fund in the new government.
Well, I'd make a point here, Ellen, that Australia, obviously, there are absolutes and then there are relativities compared to China. The absolute is that Australia, as the dominant power in the Pacific, has a responsibility, moral but also geopolitical, to assist the Pacific Islands with all of their problems, and there are many. The Pacific Islands are some of the poorest countries on the planet. Australia's development assistance has been negligent ever since the 1970s, when Australia gave PNG independence. We've been incredibly negligent, and only China has brought Australia's attention back, and that's shameful. But it's back, and Australia needs to do more. But then there's the relativities. So let's be real here. Australia remains the dominant aid provider to the region. I think it's 1.4 billion last year. The Labor's policy is to add another $500 million Australian dollars a year over the next 4 years. So there will be more development aid to the Pacific, and that dwarfs the amount that China is spending. Where China spends in the Pacific that Australia can't compete is putting bribes in politicians' bank accounts. That's the reality, and that's happening and has happened. And we know that from other politicians and public figures and reporting in the South Pacific. So that's one. And the other one is on climate change and the real buff-headedness in Australian diplomacy here. I mean, Australia is a country that, regardless of how poor the targets were, was reducing its emissions and now is going to accelerate the pace of reducing emissions under the new government. China is increasing its emissions and has a specific policy commitment to increase their emissions until the year 2030. They're going to be increasing, not decreasing. So China is no friend of the Pacific or the world in terms of cutting emissions.
We're nearly out of time.
That was the point I was going to make, the irony of this chequebook diplomacy, which one of the risks is loading up some of these nations with debt, which, as George said, would be just, putting problem on problem. And yet their record on climate, on emissions is terrible. So it's just a failure, I guess, as you say, that there's been a vacuum perhaps left there and China has come in, possibly with not the best of intentions.
George, I'm going to do this to you. You're a new panellist, but just give me 30 seconds. What's your advice? Listening, trust, what's the words?
Australia has come out and wants to be a climate champion working with the Pacific. I think the part of that is for Australia to also push the other G20 economies, speaking with the Pacific in this regard. While Pacific has been successful in terms of moral diplomacy global, there's still that group that includes China and India, and this is where Australia can really come through.
Wonderful, you did it. Thank you so much for that. That's all we have time for. Thanks to Wendy Machin, Peter Harcher, our two new panellists, Imelda Davis and George Carter. Wonderful to hear your voices. Jeremy Fernandez is with you tomorrow night. Have a great evening. Good night to you.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
Why do we have to be held to account for the mess that Morrison government has left us?
And you never know what might happen.
Thank goodness you're not running the government.
Well, you're not running it either anymore.
On the eve of the 30th anniversary of the historic Mabo decision, Stan Grant is joined by Gail Mabo, Linda Burney, Chris Kenny and Shireen Morris. Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Anthony Albanese to lead a majority government, with the ABC calling the crucial 76 seats for Labor. Another changing of the guard in Canberra, with Peter Dutton elected unopposed and Barnaby Joyce dumped for David Littleproud. Giro hero Jai Hindley becomes just the second Australian to win one of cycling's Grand Tours.
And coming up on the business, demerger dumped. Pressure from billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes scuttles AGL's coal spin-off plans.
Hello, Michael Tetlow with ABC Late News. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is set to lead a majority government, with the Melbourne seat of Macnamara now projected to go to Labor. Here's Chief Election Analyst Anthony Green.
At the end of counting on Monday night, it's clear that the Albanese government has achieved a basic majority. We're giving the Labor Party 76, the Coalition 57, 4 Greens, 12 others, 2 seats remain in doubt. What we've done today is we've given away the electorate of Macnamara. Now, this has been a very complex three-cornered contest. Labor's in first, Greens second, Liberals third, but the exclusion of these candidates was making it a very close contest where all 3 candidates had a little over 33% of the vote. Who dropped out would determine the winner. In the end, Labor is still 400 votes ahead of the Greens at a critical point of the count. Liberals had moved into first place, and that's enough, with less than 2,000 votes to come, to be able to declare that Josh Burns will be re-elected as a member for Macnamara, bringing the Albanese government to 76 seats. The other seats remaining in doubt at the end of today are Gilmore on the south coast of New South Wales. Andrew Constance is the former Transport Minister in New South Wales. Today, the absent votes heavily favoured Labor, and Labor is back in front by about 140 votes after being behind by 210 yesterday. And at this stage, with the trend in the absence, it may well be that Labor also wins Gilmore, but it remains in doubt at this stage. The other seat that hasn't been given away is Deakin. It has narrowed for the Liberal Party today, and the Labor is now closer. It's only on 49.7 as opposed to 49.5. But it hasn't been narrowing quickly enough to suspect that Labor can still get ahead. At this stage, the Liberals would be favour. Michael Sukkar, the former Assistant Treasurer, holds the seat. So at this stage, Deakin is still in doubt, but leaning towards the Liberal Party. But definitely given away is Macnamara and Gilmore. Labor's now ahead, but still too close to call.
Anthony Green there. Still reeling from their election loss, the Liberals and Nationals have elevated 2 new men to lead their parties in opposition. Former Defence Minister Peter Dutton is urging voters to see beyond his hard-edged reputation as he looks to hold the Albanese government to account. Meanwhile, former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has been defeated in a contest for the Nationals' leadership. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
From the ruins of defeat, Peter Dutton emerges unopposed as Liberal leader. His attitude immediate.
To clean up Labor's mess in 3 years' time. They are going to be a bad government. There's no doubt in my mind.
The coalition hard man's deputy, regional Liberal MP Susan Lee, quick to acknowledge where their work is needed most.
My message to the women of Australia is, we hear you, we heard you, and we are determined to earn back your trust and your faith.
The man who lost it commending the new leadership team.
Deeply committed Australians to both the Liberal cause and, of course, the cause of the nation.
But Scott Morrison's successor, a former policeman, indicating he'll back a strong anti-corruption watchdog.
I'm a strong supporter of the ICAC. I believe in transparency, and I always have.
Mr Morrison sledged ICAC as a kangaroo court, but matters of integrity helped sweep Teal independents to power, knocking out many moderate Liberals from their inner city seats.
I commend the motion to the House.
Peter Dutton accepting he was wrong to walk out on the historic apology to the stolen generations 14 years ago.
I made a mistake in relation to the apology. At the time, I believed that the apology should be given when the problems were resolved, and the problems are not resolved.
A changing of the guard too in the Nationals party room. David Littleproud becoming leader of the junior coalition party, ousting Barnaby Joyce, who City Liberals blame for suppressing their vote.
It's using common sense and being in the sensible centre. That's where you win elections, not chasing extremities.
Well, I suppose you think I'm sad. Not really.
With former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg among those lost to the Teals, Peter Dutton was the Liberals' only real option. He comes to the job a well-known political figure, but the tough man public persona he's long projected needs some adjustment, his colleagues say. As for the man himself, he says it's not a question of being different, but being better understood.
I'll just go.
A 21-year veteran of politics asking to be looked at afresh. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
COVID case numbers in WA are continuing to fall sharply, with the state recording its lowest daily infection figure in 4 weeks. The drop in infections comes as the Health Department reviews remaining COVID restrictions, but experts say it's too soon to remove workplace vaccine mandates.
WA's COVID figures have been improving for almost a fortnight, and the number of people in isolation is falling rapidly.
So all of this is a good sign, and West Australians can relax, but they also need to use personal discretion.
What you'll see with the COVID infections is that as they come down, people will get more ambitious, they will go out more, they will go places, they'll be a little bit less protective, they won't wear a mask as often, and you'll see the cases go back up again.
While case numbers are dropping, WA's hospitals are still facing significant strain amid staff shortages. But the Nurses Union says removing COVID vaccine requirements is not the solution.
There's a small number of people who say, well, we could solve our nursing shortage by allowing the unvaxxed to come into our system. You know, it's not going to solve the problem, and two, it sends the wrong message.
And there should be no rush to remove the requirement for other industries, according to Curtin University's School of Population Health.
I don't think they should get rid of that at this stage. We are still in the midst of a global pandemic.
There's fewer than 2% of eligible West Australians who are yet to have a single dose of a COVID vaccine.
The vaccine mandate's been a very important part of the arsenal, I suppose, of dealing with COVID. It's made us very safe. That'll continue to be in place for the foreseeable future.
The Premier has previously said the third dose rate in WA would need to be well over 80% before the rules change. It's currently 81.7. James Carmody, ABC News.
China has fallen short in its ambitious bid to sign up 10 Pacific nations to a wide-ranging trade and security deal. The country's foreign minister has met his Pacific counterparts at a top-level summit in the Fijian capital. But in the end, China's had to shelve the pact, having failed to secure the support it needed. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts reports from Suva.
Talk loudly and carry a big stick. Wang Yi's carving a path through the Pacific on his 8-nation tour, determined to cement China's commercial, security and strategic ties, while also assuring the West it has nothing to fear.
My advice to these people is don't be too anxious and don't be too nervous.
Today he sat down for a virtual meeting with 10 Pacific Island foreign ministers. On the table, a sweeping regional agreement first leaked last week, which would tie China and the Pacific together across trade, development, policing and cybersecurity.
The common development and prosperity of China and developing countries will only mean greater harmony, greater progress and greater justice across the whole world.
But the proposed agreement is contentious, with Pacific leaders warning the region could be sucked into a new Cold War.
We are concerned about the potential extent to which the nature of those agreements could extend across the whole of the Pacific.
And after today's meeting, Fiji's Prime Minister delicately hinted the agreement has been put aside, at least for now.
As always, we put consensus first among our countries throughout any discussion on new regional agreements.
China's ambassador confirming after his foreign minister left the room that it had been shelved, while Beijing tries to convince the doubters.
Of course, there are some concerns on some specific issues. And we have agreed that these two documents will be discussed afterwards.
Strategic jousting is unavoidable in the current era, with Western powers trying to compete against an increasingly authoritarian and ambitious China. Pacific Island countries are happy to leverage that when they can, but they're also urging the bigger players not to forget about the most existential threats.
We all know plenty of eyes have been on Suva during this visit. I hope we also know that geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas.
And that will require cooperation, not just competition. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Suva.
Jai Hindley has become the first Australian to win one of the world's biggest cycling races, the Giro d'Italia. The 26-year-old is only the second Australian to ever win a cycling Grand Tour. He joins Tour de France winner Cadel Evans with a finish that's energising Australian cycling. National Sport reporter David Mark has the story.
From Australia, Jai Hindley has stepped into history.
It's a beautiful feeling, really. Yeah, a lot of emotions out there today.
Hindley set up the win on Saturday when he attacked the former race leader, Olympic champion Richard Carapaz, to lead by more than a minute.
This is the moment for Hindley to be the hero of the Giro.
It was down to the final stage time trial to cement the win. He crossed the line just 7 seconds slower than Carapaz to become the first Australian Giro d'Italia winner.
Hindley has created history.
He's now just the second Australian to win one of cycling's 3 Grand Tours, after Cadel Evans led the way, winning the 2011 Tour de France.
Cadel's first win in the Tour de France was monumental. Jai's win in the Tour of Italy is just as big.
I'm really, really proud to be Australian and, happy to take this one home.
I think it's going to be very, very encouraging for kids who were perhaps looking for someone that they can cheer for at these races and encourage them to get involved in the sport, and that's exactly how Jai Hindley got involved.
Hindley may be an overnight household name, but this win was 20 years in the making, and it began at Western Australia's Midland Cycle Club.
He came out to the velodrome, which is just based outside of Perth, near Midland, and this is where it all started.
The future is looking very bright for Australian contenders in the Grand Tours, with Jack Haig third in last year's Tour of Spain and Ben O'Connor, who won a stage and came 4th overall in last year's Tour de France.
I really think it's going to help inspire the next generation of young guys and girls around the country to once again prove that Australians can do anything.
Jai Hindley is due for a break, but this year's Tour of Spain and next year's Tour de France could be the next targets. Tonight, though, he's partying in pink. David Mark, ABC News.
Dual West Coast Eagles premiership player Peter Matera is recovering in hospital after suffering a heart attack at the weekend. Matera played 253 games for the Eagles and is considered one of the club's best ever players. He was awarded the Norm Smith Medal in West Coast's first grand final victory in 1992.
Peter Matera, 52 metres, pulls it back. What a magnificent kick for goal.
In a statement, the club said it was saddened by the news and wished the 53-year-old, who now lives in regional Victoria, a speedy recovery. Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal will resume their rivalry when they meet in the French Open quarterfinals tomorrow night. World number one Djokovic defeated Argentina's Diego Schwartzman in straight sets. 13-time champion Nadal took almost 4.5 hours to overcome Canadian Felix Auger-Aliassime.
What a way to finish.
Tomorrow, gonna try my best as always. I don't know what can happen, but the only thing that I can guarantee is I'm gonna fight until the end. So many thanks.
In the women's draw, 19-year-old Leylah Fernandez remains on course for a possible semi-final against fellow teenager Coco Gauff after both players won their fourth round matches. A partly cloudy 20 degrees ahead for Perth tomorrow, partly cloudy and 32 for Darwin. Showers and 14 in Adelaide, showers developing in Hobart, showers 2 and becoming windy in Melbourne with a top of 11 degrees. Sydney and Brisbane both windy. Then looking into Wednesday, a shower or 2 for Perth with 20 degrees once again. Showers in Hobart and Melbourne. Sydney windy but mostly sunny 15. Brisbane partly cloudy and 19 degrees for Wednesday. And that's ABC Late News to the moment. I'm Michael Tetlow. Thanks for watching. From the team, take care. Stay with us for the business.
Welcome to the business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, demerger dumped, chair and CEO resign, billionaires' pressure to scuttle AGL's coal spin-off plans pays off.
The next step is to rebuild the board with the skills, talent, encouraged to take this company through the transition ahead.
And manpower, why aged care providers should be targeting more males to help avert a worker shortage crisis.
Men themselves are losing this opportunity of working in a sector that has a really bright future ahead.
Energy giant AGL has today abandoned controversial plans to hive off its traditional coal-fired power stations from the rest of the company, just weeks out from a crucial shareholder vote. In a statement to the ASX, Australia's biggest carbon emitter said it had insufficient support to meet the 75% approval threshold for the demerger and will now undertake a review of its strategic direction. CEO and Managing Director Graham Hunt and Chair Peter Botten will be stepping down upon replacement. Board members Diane Smith-Gander and Jacqueline Hay will also resign their seats, leaving 4 board positions open.
It's nothing short of a bloodbath in the boardroom of AGL, but it's been years in the making, and we'd argue that it's well overdue. Investors have been calling for renewal of the AGL board for at least the last year.
It follows intervention from tech billionaire and climate activist Mike Cannon-Brookes, who recently acquired more than 11% of AGL, making him the biggest single shareholder. Mr Cannon-Brookes says he's pleased with today's announcement and that the demerger maths made little sense.
Look, we've been very clear. We think, the first step here was the demerger proposal, which is off the table. I think as a referendum on the board, that leads to the second step, which is this is the same board that's been around for 5+ years and has overseen the destruction of a huge amount of shareholder value, and we want to see that restored. We want to see that grow. That requires board renewal, which we've seen already today. Quite a lot of the directors saying, right, we get it. That's what the shareholders want, and they've spoken for that. So the next step is to rebuild the board with the skills, talent, encouraged to take this company through the transition ahead and benefit from all those opportunities. that's certainly what we would like to see as a very next step.
You've indicated that you'd like 2 board seats, but we know 4 will be vacated out of the possible 8. What would you like to see in the makeup of that board? How many seats might you like?
Look, I think the most important thing is the skills that they bring, right, and the belief. I think this transition is obviously going to require a lot of skills in terms of the energy industry, a lot of skills in terms of corporate transition and just large-scale overhaul of a very proud company with a great history and setting it up for a great future in the decades ahead. It's a technology change, so technology skills and ambition and courage. I think leaning into these opportunities, is going to take work. There's no doubt about it. It's going to take some amount of courage and optimism in terms of how that flows forward, and we would hope to see that in the directors who are really willing to attack those opportunities and go after them with what should be a company that can benefit greatly from that transition.
The AGL board has said that it believes the closure of its Bayswater power station in 2035 and Loy Yang power station in 2045 would continue to be accelerated. How soon do you want to see these closed?
Look, I think the important part here is when do those assets cease to be profitable for the company? Which is probably significantly faster than those 2035 and 2045 dates, i.e. they start losing significant amounts of money. They're also generating very expensive energy and they're unreliable and they continue to break down more and more frequently. So that transition needs to be proactive, it needs to be managed, it needs to be very carefully planned, and it needs to make sure that we are continuing to provide the lowest price powers to the customers of the company. I think we can do that significantly faster than those dates for sure. I think the energy market and everybody else believe that is also possible. And now it's a question of the company having a Paris line plan and showing that is possible. Is there a risk, Mike, though, of pushing energy prices up in the short term if those coal-fired stations are brought offline too soon? If replacement supply is not available and those projects don't come online, sure. I believe there'll be significant replacement supply available, and certainly the more certainty we can give, we saw with Liddell, the faster that replacement supply comes online in terms of renewables with firming and storage and all the other bits and pieces that are required. The prices that people are seeing now that are very high are high for 2 reasons. One is the price of coal and gas is at all-time highs, and fossil fuel-based energy gets more expensive as the fuel gets more expensive. So that's the first reason. Secondly, those plants are very unreliable. We saw quite a lot, 30 to 40% of New South Wales and Victoria's power supply is offline from fossil fuel-based generators at the moment. And that's a significant problem because these are very old assets that are very hard to run and run reliably. As the grid gets more renewable, they become more and more unreliable. So if we want to bring prices down, yes, I think that transition is the fastest way to do it. The cost to making that grid more renewable, though, is quite a substantial one as well. $10 billion for a new transmission line in the near term to handle that output of solar and winds, according to the energy market operator. So I guess the question is, what are the economics of when you're weighing up coal-fired generation versus renewables? And can you guarantee that perhaps the plan or the vision that you might have for AGL will not see consumers paying more for energy? Firstly, in terms of the cost, I think we have to be clear that this is an investment, right? Renewable assets in general, be they transmission or generation, have an upfront cost, but save a lot of money over the long term, and hence they're incredibly financeable. So yes, the numbers that you're quoted, $10 billion, whatever it is, sound like a lot of money upfront. However, they will save consumers significant amounts of money, and they are eminently financeable over a long period of time. So as an investment, it brings people's power bills down. There's no doubt that a renewable grid, if we were 100% renewably powered by, say, 2030, which is, I believe, significantly achievable target, would have much lower power prices for consumers than if we have a fossil fuel-powered grid. Your motive, it's been reported, behind blocking the demerger has been questioned, and I'll quote Morningstar. They said that a sceptic might think that this was a ruthless plan to force the AGL Energy Board to accept a lowball takeover offer. The share price has been down around 2% today. Is there any merit in that idea, pushing the share price lower, making it a cheaper takeover target? Absolutely none. As the largest shareholder in the business, that'd be a pretty silly thing to do. Look, there's been a lot of FUD thrown around about our motivations, and every time people ask us, we're very clear. We'll continue to be clear. We've done everything we said we were going to go do. People said we wouldn't actually have the shareholding. We have the shareholding. We wouldn't actually put up the cash. We put up the cash. Other shareholders wouldn't agree with us. Other shareholders actually do agree with us. So we continue to believe the opportunities for this company are very large. That is why we are here. That is a higher share price than today. We put $650 million on the table in investment towards doing that. We've said that we clearly want a Paris-aligned plan. We believe that's the best outcome as a shareholder. We've said we want board renewal as a shareholder, and as the largest shareholder, we believe we have some say in that, and in proportion to our stake and other shareholders as well. We're doing the things that we said we were going to go do. We've said what we're going to do for 3 weeks, and every single time we've done what we said. So we'll continue to do that.
Can you rule out another takeover tilt in the future?
It certainly hasn't been anything that we've spent any time on any activity to do that. No one can know what can happen in the future in any real sense, but it's not something that we're spending any amount of calories on at the moment. No, we're entirely focused on the demerger and then the board renewal and rebuilding the company.
Mike Cannon-Brookes, thanks so much for joining us on The Business.
Thank you for having me.
Jeff Wilson from Wilson Asset Management says the demerger plan has wasted a lot of money.
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't leave it in a great position because the board that was there has wasted $160 million of shareholders' money. One of the fortunate things with AGL is their underlying business is doing exceptionally well at the moment. With the oil price up, their margins are probably the best they've been for ages. So in 6 months' time, you're going to see some pretty good earnings numbers coming out of AGL.
We just spoke to Mike Cannon-Brookes. He's the largest shareholder, as you know. How do you think he will pressure or at least engage with AGL on the future direction of the business?
Well, obviously, as the largest shareholder, a little over 11%. Then he has to engage with the board, and the board needs to engage with him. In terms of, there was talk that he wanted 2 seats. I don't think that's fair. There's 8 board members, so 1 seat is 12.5% of the board, and he's got a little less than that. So, 2 seats means he has a quarter of the board. So I don't think that's fair. How
will AGL staying together as a company now and not demerging provide greater shareholder value?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? And the board, I think 6 months ago, when AGL was in a tough position, decided that the demerger was the best way to go. And I think things have changed since there significantly. So it's really up to the incoming current board members and the incoming board members and the new CEO to map out a path for AGL that can get to grow and prosper. That's the challenge.
Jeff Wilson, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Kat.
As our population gets older, the need for more workers in aged care is increasing. Women make up around 90% of the workforce, and one way to meet the growing demand for more staff is to increase the number of men working in the sector. Daniel Ziffer met some of them.
If we're lucky, we'll all get to be old and have people like Darwin and Ashish helping to take care of us.
I mean, I love doing this, and it's very rewarding because you're going home happy.
It's a very nice feeling when someone's waiting for you. That's the feeling you get in this industry.
But men only make up around 10% of the aged care workforce.
The industry really has an image problem, and some of this is warranted, but some of it's not.
Ashish loves his work at this aged care home in Frankston on the outskirts of Melbourne. After more than a decade in the industry, he sees attitudes evolving.
I see it changing. Like I have never met any resistance or any awkward behaviour towards myself, as in people are very supportive.
But that's not happening fast enough to deal with the growing problem of not enough workers.
So if we want to do something about growing the workforce, we need to look at some of those underrepresented groups. And the most underrepresented group in the aged care workforce is actually men.
Within a decade, 1 in 5 Australians will be aged over 65. The sector's workforce is expanding by about 2% a year. Unless that doubles, we'll be 110,000 workers short by the end of the decade. That's just to keep up with minimum standards. As an increasing proportion of people live longer and develop more complex needs, the workforce will fall far short of what's required to give better care.
This is not uncommon. This is something that you see across all countries.
Chronically low pay creates high staff turnover and turns off potential employees.
From a perception perspective, well, aged care work is seen as being dirty, it's difficult, it's dangerous.
The award wage for personal care workers is almost a third lower than in disability care. And more than 10% of aged care staff hold a second job to get by. Economists say the problems go deeper.
They have integrated the fact that this is not a good career for a man, and there are all those sort of masculinity norms that are deeply ingrained in people.
It doesn't have to be this way. Aged care jobs are growing, open to people with different levels of qualification, and can be done in almost every suburb and town in Australia. But unless historically low pay rates are boosted and stereotypes about masculinity in caring roles are altered, there won't be enough people to give the level of care required.
Men themselves are losing this opportunity of working in a sector that has a really bright future ahead.
Men already working in care invite others to join them.
I think this is the only one I want to do for the rest of my life, for sure.
Were you going out today? Did we hold you up? It's very rewarding. It's not like any other regular job. It's not where you would just be standing at a machine and doing a continuous job for the whole day. Things change every single day in here.
And every day, the need for care increases.
Daniel Ziffer there. To markets now, and tech stocks led the way. The All Ordinaries adding 1.5%, and the Aussie dollar is higher at 71.85 US cents. And that's all from the business. You can watch an extended version of our interview with Mike Cannon-Brooks on iView. I'm Catherine Robinson. See you next time.
As they say here on Ghana country, Nina Mani. My name is Jack Evans and I'm here at Warraparinga to bring you Languages and Me, a special program that looks at the role language plays for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Australia is home to hundreds of First Nations with different languages that have connection to culture, country and their ancestors. But since colonisation, a lot of those languages have been lost. It's had devastating impacts, as for many, language is really important. It teaches us about ourselves, the world around us and where we've come from, as well as what roles we play within our families and our communities. The more we can hear and learn the language of our ancestors, the more we can learn about ourselves. This year marks the start of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Part of that is highlighting the work done by language custodians to preserve language as an important part of our cultural and social lives. First Languages Australia, which is the peak body for First Nation languages here in Australia, has travelled around the country working with traditional owners to find out what language means to them. One of the most common ways people connect with language is through their identity. And the women we're about to meet in these next stories share how language has done just that, whether it's speaking it with their own mob or sharing it to educate a wider audience. It gives them a sense of pride that you'll see shines through as they speak.
My name is Leonora Adidi. My language is Kalakaua. My island home is Saibai Island in the Torres Strait. Knowing my language gives me a deeper sense of identity. It places me within my culture, within my family, within my land, within my community. How I perceive the world and the way to express that is through my language. I love the richness of my language. It is very poetic. It's a very lyrical language. When you are with a group of language speakers, you naturally will start talking in the language, so it's just a natural expression. It becomes very important and very meaningful. It gives a sense of pride to the person who's listening. It becomes a responsibility to teach that language whenever I can. Singing and dancing is a part of our expression of who we are as people, of our everyday lives. I can't imagine language without singing and dancing. It's as natural as speaking. This is how we express our stories, our history, our relationship with the world around us. You will know exactly who you are. Once you start learning to speak your language, you will uncover the most wonderful way to view the world. And you will feel complete because it will position you where you belong within your culture.
Language for me is identity. What's language for you?
My language groups are Warramunga, Warlpiri and Aranda. I write, direct and produce documentaries, factual series and drama TV. I had a really burning desire to kind of tell my stories or stories from my community, so I started writing. My biggest passion about filmmaking is telling stories from our community. We're seeing people who look like us sharing their stories and giving us hope or giving us advice or just entertaining us. It instills pride and confidence, you know, in going, oh my God, there's a black face on screen, and it's a really positive story. The one thing that I want audiences to take away from the films that I make is to break down the stereotypes. For me, growing up, the only time you saw a black person on television was when they were getting arrested or taken off to court. So we are the same as everybody else. We have happiness, we love the same, we have joy, sadness. It was important to me to kind of tell stories, celebrating that and making people proud of who we are. I think language in terms of storytelling allows you to take that story to the next level, to connect it and ground it in place and time and people. It's about taking that story to a deeper level.
I understand there's salt water and fresh water.
Yeah, so we got Garang, that's our freshwater mob, Garang, that's our salt water.
Learn your language, you know it and be familiar with it and be able to recognise it when it's out there in the world. I think it's a really strong grounding force to your country and your culture and your family and who you are. And essentially, your stories are within your language and they've carried it for thousands of years. And I think there is something really significant and beautiful in being able to carry that within you, if not share it with other people.
Language for me is our story. What's language for you?
And it really is wonderful to see the joy it brings them in being able to share their languages with others. Now, one of the impacts of colonisation has been the loss of hundreds of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages. It's been a painful separation for many. But now we're starting to see a new and exciting chapter where languages are being reinvigorated and preserved. And one of the ways that's being done is through music. The people we're about to meet in these next stories share how being able to perform and sing in the language of their ancestors carries an incredible amount of emotion.
My name's Chris Tamway. I'm originally from the Torres Strait Islands, from an island called Badu Island. I'm a travelling musician that travels nationally and internationally. My language groups are Kalalagauya, Kalakauya and Meriam. I feel very honoured to be able to sing in my language. It makes me feel a sense of reassurance, a sense of connection, just to be able to share music in language to educate other people.
My 2 years. 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 2 years
Kurbaya daye, kurbaya daye, kurbaya dayagarya. Singing in language is all about preserving culture for myself, and I feel that I am doing that when performing. Also make other people aware of the Torres Strait Islands and our languages. I feel so proud to be able to sing in my language, and I always carry pride, and I just feel like my ancestors are speaking through me in the form of music in my language. Language for me is music. What's language for you?
My name is Emily Woodamara. I'm a Wurundjeri woman from Goat Island and Bigoton Island in the Northern Territory. I'm a singer-songwriter, a full-time mom, and I'm really passionate about preserving my language and my history through music and educating our future generations to stand in their power and be strong. My process when I write songs in language is to go down outside to the beach, for example, and try to get a smell of the sea salt, because I'm a saltwater woman. I grew up on an island, and so the beach is my heart's home. These waters connect to my country and to my home. It's a special way of writing because you're listening to what's around you, also giving and holding space to what's inside you. For me, when I write and I sing in Anandaliokwa, it makes me feel really powerful. I live far away from home, so singing in my language makes me feel connected to my country, connected to my culture, connected to my people. Language makes me feel strong, not just physically strong, emotionally strong, spiritually strong. It heals me in ways where I know that I'm okay, I know that that's my ancestors speaking to me, I know that that's a legacy that will never die. Language is forever. So language connects you to more than just your identity, it connects you to the place, and that place it's your heart healing place, and that's very, very special. Language for me is healing. What's language for you?
You can really see the strength of this movement of writing and performing in First Nation languages right around the country, with artists like Baker Boy and Mitch Tambo bringing their language to a mainstream audience. And we're also seeing entire stadium crowds standing to the national anthem in a First Nations language, something that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. Before we get to our next stories, I'm with Karina Lester, who is from the mobile language team at the University of Adelaide. Hi, Karina. Thank you for joining me from Alice Springs.
Oh, way, Jack. Thanks for having me.
Now, obviously, we're talking all about languages, and you're actually fluent in a number of languages. Is that correct?
Yeah, I speak two from the Western Desert language, which is Yankunytjatjara and Bidyandjatjara. So that's a fairly big area of the Western Desert region. And yeah, well, I speak English then as well. So I've got a bit of an understanding with languages in South Australia, in the far northwest, and then slightly into WA as well.
And so being multilingual and having this knowledge, what does language mean to you?
Well, a big part of it, Jack, is about being a part of culture and a language group that has particular connect to country. So with my skills in my Bijanjara Yankunytjatjara language, we have that cultural area of the Arnongo Bijanjara Yankunytjatjara lands. But languages don't stop at territory borders or, state borders. So I have connect up there into the Uluru area as well. So, because that's where Yankunytjatjara travels up to. So, it gives me a bit of a broader understanding of my region and in particular the areas that I fit into. So having language skill connects me to country and it connects me to the stories and it connects me through my kinship structure as well. So I have kin that are part of our Western Desert connect to our country and our people.
And so how do you have these languages? Who taught them to you?
I grew up at a place called Biramimi, which is Mimili, or also known as the Everard Ranges. And it was there at Biramimi where I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, who were quite instrumental in teaching language, and in particular teaching Yankunytjatjara language. So Bijanjara language was something Nana had spoken as well, because she's from further west, closer to the WA border. So I was very lucky at that time, grown up in the 70s, and Nana and my grandparents, my grandfather, they were all fluent language speakers. I was growing up at Mimili at the time when my late father, Yami Lester, was running Mimili as a cattle station. So he and his family were all around that area, and I was really quite emerged into it because language was the only form of communication, speaking Yankunytjatjara. English was just starting to come into it.
And so do you feel that your languages are safe because people are speaking them?
Today, Jack, languages are very much still at risk. And our languages in Central Australia, although they are fluently spoken and there is the transmission from speakers to the next generation, there are largely a lot of influences around as well. So, social structures are changing. There's influences of TikTok and technology. So, they sort of, when they interfere with the social structure, you get that, red flags or, language shifting to language not being used as often and perhaps English being incorporated into it. So that's where we start to see a bit of the language shift from, fluent Yankunytjatjara, Bijanjara or even Aranda language here to, Yankunytjatjara, Bijanjara, Aranda with a bit of English thrown into it as well. And, that's where, that's inevitable when you've got, social structural changes. It brings those changes into the language, and language is shifting now.
And so looking forward, how do we go about protecting languages for future generations?
Look, that's a really good question, Jack. I think there's a lot of work, and I feel that there's hope in, you've got government policies that have come into place, you've got targets that are coming into place, like the Target 16 of the Closing the Gap has a real big focus on language and the transmission of that language. So, I think there's real hope in keeping those languages when you get buy-in by governments and, at your states and your territories, but also at a national level. I think there's hope that languages can be maintained for the future generation. Because we are speakers of our language, we often work as interpreters and translators. The importance is to really keep that strong in not only being able to interpret and translate, but to also write our language as well, which, leads to developing resources that are bilingual resources and, capturing beautiful oral history stories that are written in a local language. And maybe that you develop a audio piece for that as well, and so you hear that language and you see the stories of that language or see the painting of that language. So, there's so much that can be done on language, and I think it's a revaluing of the importance of language to people, to our own mob, to every Central Australian Aboriginal person and right across the nation as well, Aboriginal people you know, that we value. This thing is important because it connects us to our states and territories, it connects us to our nation.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, Karina. It's been really lovely chatting with you.
Happy to do that, Jack. Thank you for the opportunity.
Up next, we take a look at how language is linked to political advocacy and the relationship between the Australian landscape and language. You only have to look at a map and you'll see names of places that have been taken from a First Nations language. And in recent years, we've seen the adoption of dual names, which acknowledge the traditional names that have been used for thousands of years. For some, understanding the knowledge held in these traditional names is an important part of recognising and respecting ownership of the land and its history.
My name is Teresa Sainty. I am a Pakana woman, that is a Tasmanian Aboriginal woman from Lutruwita, which is the proper name of Tasmania. I am the Aboriginal Linguistic Consultant for the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre's language program. When we talk about the original Tasmanian Aboriginal languages that have been sleeping for some time, the first port of call is place names, is to revive some place words and to be able to say them out loud for the first time, often in, 150 years or so. What a fantastic feeling to be able to go to a place where you know your people have been and be able to say the proper word for that place. What better way is there to honour those old people and the legacy? My mission is to continue to honour those old people's legacy. When I go to Kunani, which is a proper name for Mount Wellington, I'm walking in the same way as my old fellows did, as the ancestors did. I feel so connected, from the soles of my feet. It doesn't matter whether it's dual named, up there on signage with the foreign name of Mount Wellington. We know that the proper name for that place is Kunani because it's always been in country and it always will be in country. It will always be Kunani. We need to be thinking in that language once again. Language for me is legacy. What's language for you?
My name is Darren McKenney, born on Wabakal country, but my heritage takes me to Kamilaroi and Wiradjuri nations. I'm the founding director of Miramar Aboriginal Language and Technology Centre, specialised in supporting people, saving their language, saving their knowledges. Language is a gateway to our knowledge systems, and our languages and our knowledges are all environmentally based. When we first started, we put in the word for wind, whippy, and we'd have a person speak it. But then we were like, let's go out and let's record wind, let's record the environment, walk country with microphone in hand, with camera in hand, and capture all the amazing moments which we possibly can to learn about country from its speaking. But country is not just where our feet walk. To listen to country and to learn where our languages have come from, we also record what's in the ocean. Whether it's the dolphins, whether it's the whales, we want to hear the male songman. We want to hear the mum and the children in the background. We need to care about our languages, we need to protect our languages, but we need to use our languages, our gateway to a knowledge system which is far greater than we can ever believe. Our languages is what has helped us learn about the environment, learn about country, allowing us to care for it and for it to care for us. Not until you can think and speak within that language, within that knowledge system, that you understand the power that it can have. language can actually allow First Nations people to be strong going forward. Language for me is country. What's language for you?
Now, for any language to be continued to be spoken, it needs to be passed on to the next generations. And these days, there's a whole range of programs that are being used to tackle this challenge, from language nests in preschools to teaching resources being created in a local language, as well as the establishment of a national program to train first language teachers. Finally, today, we're going to hear from some people about how important it is to pass on and share First Nation languages.
My name is Benetta Marie Marbo. I am a Mumbra woman. I am also a Meriam woman, a mother, a youth worker, an artist. What I'm most passionate about is advocating for women and girls in the criminal justice system. I work for an organisation called Sisters Inside, and one of our most successful programs is our art program. They aim to support girls to give them a voice, to be able to express themselves in ways that they probably have not been given the tools to. By giving the girls a space and a place to create, and also curiosity about where they come from, we make sure that art and language is connected. After being in that art program, you're like, well, who's your mob? Go find out from your family. I have a daughter who is 4 years old and her name is Pipey. Once I became a mother, I found it very important for me to teach the little language that I did know to my daughter, but also learn with her. She knows what her eyes are, puni, her ears are talinga. It's a learning journey for both of us. Her name, Pipey, it's a peer drum woman name, connects us to our language, it connects us to our place, it connects us to our people. For her to have that strong connection to language is so important. It's my language. It's also the connection to all of our ancestors and all the strong women that made us who we are and brought her to where she is now. Language for me is art. What's language for you?
My name is Josie Bonner. My traditional name is Ngararui, which means sea waves. My country is Bachelor. My passion is language and culture. I teach it to a younger generation, our Gundus, because they are our next carriers. Land is connected to us as we are connected to the land. So we try and engage and take our Gundus on the journey of learning language on country, out in the open, surrounded by beautiful mountains. It'll be next to lakes, next to water. It'll be on the sand. We try and focus on learning in the outdoors. When you sit with those Gundus, you can see that they're crying out for so much more. Something's lost. They come and learn and they love it. They can't get enough of it. This is where we learn about our Wangari, the dingo, water, which is gung. So there's many special things that our Gundus learn on Bachelor country. And then you'll have them doing their own language, doing their own songs, which makes it that more special because they become the most glorious child where they're not afraid, and when they sing, it's like they're singing to their ancestors. The effect that it has on me is very emotional, and it just makes my heart sing too, because I think it's something that they can all be proud of for the future.
Language for me is future. What's language for you?
Well, that brings us to the end of this very special program. I really hope you've gotten a sense of the deep connection the people in these stories that we've shared with you have as they reconnect with their languages in their own personal way, whether it's reviving what's been lost or preserving for future generations. And if you want to know more about the First Nations language of where you're from, you can check out the Gambay map on the ABC Indigenous website. I'm Jack Evans. Thanks for watching.
An unbelievable new series.
Nice!
With stories so ridiculous,
I once broke Bob Marley's toilet.
they may actually be true.
Many levels. Mind games
Would I Lie to You? Thursday on ABC iView and TV+.
Journey to another world as ABC Classic brings you the Classic 100 Music for the Screen. From Game of Thrones to The Crown, from Mario Brothers to Final Fantasy, from Jaws to Star Wars. Celebrate your favourite music from film, television and gaming with Australia's biggest weekend of classical music. The Classic 100 Music for the Screen. Log in to vote now at abc.net.au/classic.
Some people search for it, others hide from it, from household names to people who have found themselves in the spotlight. Join me, Courtney Act, on 1+1 as I speak to well-known Australians about what fame means to them.
1+1 with Courtney Act, Thursday 9:35 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Look, it's a flashy gimmick to market the new season of Ruin.
This is genius. Great advertising.
Featuring your favourite advertising experts.
Collect us all.
Fully customisable to fit your personality. And they'll sing your favourite advertising jingles.
No, we won't, but we will deconstruct the way that brands are trying to sell to you.
It's the new and improved Gruin.
It's the same show as ever. Now let me out of here.
Gruin. Available June 8 at a new time of 8 p.m. Free delivery via ABC TV and ABC iView. Battery sold separately.
This is an historic day.
The ABC calls seat 76 for Labor, Anthony Albanese, to lead a majority government. An opposition leadership overhaul. Peter Dutton elected unopposed and Barnaby Joyce stumped for David Littleproud. Pacific countries reject China's proposed security deal after meeting China's foreign minister. And Giro hero Jai Hindley becomes just the second Australian to win one of cycling's grand tours. Hello, Michael Tetlow with ABC Late News. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is set to lead a majority government, with the Melbourne seat of Macnamara now projected to go to Labor. Here's Chief Election Analyst Anthony Green.
At the end of counting on Monday night, it's clear that the Albanese government has achieved a basic majority. We're giving the Labor Party 76, the Coalition 57, 4 Greens, 12 others, 2 seats remain in doubt. What we've done today is we've given away the electorate of Macnamara. Now, this has been a very complex three-cornered contest. Labor's in first, Greens second, Liberals third, but the exclusion of these candidates was making it a very close contest where all 3 candidates had a little over 33% of the vote. Who dropped out would determine the winner. In the end, Labor is still 400 votes ahead of the Greens at a critical point of the count. Liberals had moved into first place, and that's enough with less than 2,000 votes to come to be able to declare that Josh Burns will be re-elected as a member for Macnamara, bringing the Albanese government to 76 seats. The other seats remaining in doubt at the end of today are Gilmore on the south coast of New South Wales. Andrew Constance is the former Transport Minister in New South Wales. Today, the absent votes heavily favoured Labor, and Labor is back in front by about 140 votes after being behind by 210 yesterday. And at this stage, with the trend in the absence, it may well be that Labor also wins Gilmore, but it remains in doubt in this stage. The other seat that hasn't been given away is Deakin. It has narrowed for the Liberal Party today, and the Labor is now closer. It's only on 49.7 as opposed to 49.5. But it hasn't been narrowing quickly enough to suspect that Labor can still get ahead. At this stage, the Liberals will be favour. Michael Sukkar, the former Assistant Treasurer, holds the seat. So at this stage, Deakin is still in doubt, but leaning towards the Liberal Party. But definitely given away is Macnamara and Gilmore. Labor's now ahead, but still too close to call.
Anthony Green there. Still reeling from their election loss, the Liberals and Nationals have elevated 2 new men to lead their parties in opposition. Former Defence Minister Peter Dutton is urging voters to see beyond his hard-edged reputation as he looks to hold the Albanese government to account. Meanwhile, former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce has been defeated in a contest for the Nationals leadership. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
From the ruins of defeat, Peter Dutton emerges unopposed as Liberal leader. His attitude immediate.
To clean up Labor's mess in 3 years' time. They are going to be a bad government. There's no doubt in my mind.
The coalition hardman's deputy, regional Liberal MP Susan Lee, quick to acknowledge where their work is needed most.
My message to the women of Australia is, we hear you, we heard you, and we are determined to earn back your trust and your faith.
The man who lost it commending the new leadership team.
Deeply committed Australians to both the Liberal cause and, of course, the cause of the nation.
But Scott Morrison's successor, a former policeman, indicating he'll back a strong anti-corruption watchdog.
I'm a strong supporter of the ICAC. I believe in transparency, and I always have.
Mr Morrison sledged ICAC as a kangaroo court, but matters of integrity helped sweep Teal independents to power, knocking out many moderate Liberals from their inner city seats.
I commend the motion to the House.
Peter Dutton accepting he was wrong to walk out on the historic apology to the stolen generations 14 years ago.
I made a mistake in relation to the apology. At the time, I believed that the apology should be given when the problems were resolved, and the problems are not resolved.
A changing of the guard too in the Nationals party room. David Littleproud becoming leader of the junior coalition party, ousting Barnaby Joyce, who City Liberals blame for suppressing their vote.
It's using common sense and being in the sensible centre. That's where you win elections, not chasing extremities.
Well, I suppose you think I'm sad. Not really.
With former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg among those lost to the Teals, Peter Dutton was the Liberals' only real option. He comes to the job a well-known political figure, but the tough man public persona he's long projected needs some adjustment, his colleagues say. As for the man himself, he says it's not a question of being different, but being better understood.
I'll just go.
A 21-year veteran of politics asking to be looked at afresh. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
China has fallen short in its ambitious bid to sign up 10 Pacific nations to a wide-ranging trade and security deal. The country's foreign minister has met his Pacific counterparts at a top-level summit in the Fijian capital. But in the end, China's had to shelve the pact, having failed to secure the support it needed. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts reports from Suva.
Talk loudly and carry a big stick. Wang Yi's carving a path through the Pacific on his 8-nation tour, determined to cement China's commercial, security and strategic ties, while also assuring the West it has nothing to fear.
My advice to these people is don't be too anxious and don't be too nervous.
Today he sat down for a virtual meeting with 10 Pacific Island foreign ministers. On the table, a sweeping regional agreement first leaked last week, which would tie China and the Pacific together across trade, development, policing and cybersecurity.
The common development and prosperity of China and developing countries will only mean greater harmony, greater progress and greater justice across the whole world.
But the proposed agreement is contentious, with Pacific leaders warning the region could be sucked into a new Cold War.
We are concerned about the potential extent to which the nature of those agreements could extend across the whole of the Pacific.
And after today's meeting, Fiji's Prime Minister delicately hinted the agreement has been put aside, at least for now.
As always, we put consensus first among our countries throughout any discussion on new regional agreements.
China's ambassador confirming after his foreign minister left the room that it had been shelved, while Beijing tries to convince the doubters.
Of course, there are some concerns on some specific issues. And we have agreed that these two documents will be discussed afterwards.
Strategic jousting is unavoidable in the current era, with Western powers trying to compete against an increasingly authoritarian and ambitious China. Pacific Island countries are happy to leverage that when they can, but they're also urging the bigger players not to forget about the most existential threats.
We all know plenty of eyes have been on Suva during this visit. I hope we also know that geopolitical point scoring means less than little to anyone whose community is slipping beneath the rising seas.
And that will require cooperation, not just competition. Stephen Jedgetts, ABC News, Suva.
President Volodymyr Zelensky has made a rare trip to visit his troops on the front line in eastern Ukraine. He went to Kharkiv, the second largest city, where more than 2,000 apartment buildings have been destroyed. He met with officials to talk about reconstruction in the region and handed out medals to his troops.
I want to thank each of you for your service. You risk your life for all of us and for our state. Thank you for defending the independence of our country.
Russian soldiers, supported by intense shelling, have fired on dozens of communities in their fight to take control of the eastern Donbas region. Tensions have flared in East Jerusalem as thousands of right-wing Israelis marched through the city to celebrate its capture more than 50 years ago. The annual flag march is seen by Palestinians as a provocation, and there are fears it could set off a new wave of violence. Middle East correspondent Alison Horn reports.
Before the march even began, tensions were at boiling point. Police used rubber-tipped bullets and pepper spray to disperse Palestinian protesters from Jerusalem's old city, clearing the way for tens of thousands of Israeli nationalists to mark the capture of East Jerusalem in the 1967 war. For them, it's a celebration.
It's not like we're not trying to do something wrong or something, and it's our country.
We came to dance for Jerusalem. My neighbors aren't so happy that we're here, but we didn't come to annoy them.
Palestinians who want the eastern section as the capital of a future state see this event as a provocation. The friction further fuelled by racist chants like "death to Arabs."
They behave like we don't exist. We don't live here.
I feel very sad to see how the people behave towards me. If I complain, the police will blame me.
This area here is Damascus Gate. These Israelis will go through the gate into the old city and through the Muslim quarter. This area is really considered the heart of Jerusalem for Palestinians. They've been banned from here today in an attempt to de-escalate tensions.
Those who got near were quickly thwarted by police. 3 Israelis and dozens of Palestinians were injured in the clashes. The Palestinian militant group Hamas has threatened retaliation. There are fears the violence could escalate. Alison Horn, ABC News, Jerusalem.
The US Justice Department says it will conduct a review of the police response to the nation's deadliest school shooting in a decade. President Joe Biden visited memorials at the Robb Elementary School in Texas, where a gunman killed 19 children and 2 teachers. Anger's growing over why armed officers waited outside a classroom for more than 40 minutes while children inside made panicked 911 calls. The community's calling for concrete action. The President responded by saying "we will" before going on to meet parents of the murdered children. A video of a 30-year-old police interview with former Sydney teacher Chris Dawson has been played at his murder trial. In it, Mr Dawson tells detectives allegations he was responsible for his wife's disappearance were a product of a bitter custody battle.
At a Queensland police station in January 1991, allegations were put squarely to Chris Dawson. He told detectives of matrimonial problems before his first wife, Lynette, failed to meet him at Northbridge Baths 9 years earlier. He claimed he received several long-distance phone calls from her in subsequent weeks.
The last phone call I had from her was that she was feeling stronger and better, and I wasn't to be concerned.
Mr Dawson has pleaded not guilty to murder. The Crown case is that he killed Lynette Dawson to have an unfettered relationship with his babysitter known as JC. By the time of the police interview, Mr Dawson had married and then separated from JC.
The whole purpose of raising allegations is to slur my character with an upcoming custody battle, which is turning extremely nasty and bitter. Also doesn't know of the nights that I lay awake crying my heart out, hoping for some contact from him. The nights that I'd spent extremely concerned about his whereabouts.
JC had alleged Mr Dawson once told her he'd thought about getting a hitman to kill Lynette Dawson, but backed out because innocent people might get killed.
What do you have to say about that allegation? Complete and utter fabrication.
During the hour-long interview, Chris Dawson told detectives he'd attended marriage guidance counselling with Lynette Dawson days before she left. He remembered walking out of the session holding hands, thinking their problems would be resolved. Jamie McKinnell, ABC News, Sydney.
A 4-month-old boy has been safely reunited with his mother after a thief stole the woman's car from an Adelaide car park with the baby inside. For more than 2 hours, police and the public engaged in a citywide search for the vehicle, which was eventually found abandoned with the boy still buckled up in the back. A man was tonight arrested.
Safely back in mum's arms, a much-needed cuddle and a feed after hours separated by a brazen act of theft.
At a 4-month-old, you can imagine the distress that caused mum.
All I could just see was a very happy female police officer nodding her head, and then once we'd pulled into the driveway, we saw the thumbs up, and then we just heard that blessed cry of the baby, and euphoria just kicks in.
The baby had been in his capsule in the back of the car when his 29-year-old mum quickly ducked into this Clemzig deli to grab breakfast. Police allege this man then arrived in a stolen ute before climbing into the woman's Honda Jazz and driving away with the baby still inside.
All of a sudden she dropped everything, run like anything.
By the time we'd heard the voices, I heard the spinning wheels of the car speeding off or trying to.
As the stolen Holden Jazz headed north, the mother made a call to police.
She was hysterical and asked for a phone.
Who threw resources at a major search. With the help of a device inside the car, officers eventually tracked it to Enfield, a few kilometres away.
Just got a sense of goosebumps and almost, I didn't have anything to do with it, but a sense of pride, like we found the baby. Like there's just good on your community.
Police say the baby is doing well and didn't need to go to hospital. Hours later, officers arrested a 37-year-old Para Hills man in connection with the day's events. He's expected to face court on Tuesday. Claire Campbell, ABC News, Adelaide.
As the population gets older, demand for aged care workers is growing. But experts warn Australia's heading for acute staff shortages unless more men join the female-dominated industry. Business reporter Daniel Ziffer has more.
People like Darwin and Ashish put the care into aged care.
I mean, I love doing this and it's very rewarding because you're going home happy.
It's a very nice feeling when someone's waiting for you. That's the feeling you get in this industry.
But men are only about 10% of the workforce.
Aged care work is seen as being dirty, it's difficult, it's dangerous.
The industry really has an image problem, and some of this is warranted, but some of it's not.
Within a decade, 1 in 5 Australians will be aged over 65. The sector's workforce is expanding by about 2% a year. Unless that doubles, we'll be 110,000 workers short by the end of the decade. That's just to keep up with minimum standards. As an increasing proportion of people live longer and develop more complex needs, the workforce will fall far short of what's required to give better care.
So if we want to do something about growing the workforce, we need to look at some of those underrepresented groups, and the most underrepresented group in the aged care workforce is actually men.
Chronically low pay creates high staff turnover and turns off potential employees. The award wage for personal care workers is almost a third lower than in disability care. Economists say the problems go deeper.
There are all those sort of masculinity norms that are deeply ingrained in people.
Men already working in care invite others to join them.
Well, I think this is the only one I want to do for the rest of my life, for sure.
Jobs are growing, open to people with different qualifications and able to be done in every town and suburb. But without changes to pay and perceptions, there won't be enough people to provide the care required. Daniel Ziffer, ABC News.
AGL Energy has abandoned plans to split off its coal-fired power station, saying it didn't think the move would get enough support from shareholders. It's a win for the company's largest shareholder, billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes, who campaigned against the move.
A tech billionaire's slick campaign to rewrite AGL's future strategy has actually worked.
I need you to help us vote against and defeat the demerger.
Australia's biggest energy company is no longer planning to spin off its coal-fired power stations into a separate entity.
It's a win for corporate democracy in this particular case, and hopefully for people voting for the opportunities of decarbonisation for Australia.
AGL's long-held demerger plan was due to be voted on next month. It's now been scrapped. In an update to the ASX, the company said given the opposition from a small number of investors, including Mike Cannon-Brookes' Grok Ventures, the demerger will not receive sufficient support. AGL's decision comes after the billionaire's 2 failed takeover bids and a share raid that's made him the firm's largest shareholder.
The first step is board renewal. The second step is a clearly Paris-aligned plan that meets the science targets, because that will unlock financing at a lower cost of capital.
In a boardroom clear-out, those who've been arguing for months in support of AGL's demerger plans, like Chief Executive Graham Hunt and Chairman Peter Botten, will now leave the company. And so will 2 other high-profile directors, leaving a leadership vacuum and chaos in a 180-year-old business.
It's nothing short of a bloodbath in the boardroom of AGL. But it's been years in the making.
Investment fund Van Eck has a 0.4% stake in AGL and is worried about the energy giant's finances.
The fact that they don't now have financing in place for a single entity is something that the company will have to focus on.
Mike Cannon-Brookes says he's in talks with the company and hasn't ruled out another takeover bid. Rihanna Whitson, ABC News.
Jai Hindley has become the first Australian to win one of the world's biggest cycling races, the Giro d'Italia. The 26-year-old is only the second Australian to ever win a cycling Grand Tour. He joins Tour de France winner Cadel Evans with a finish that's energising Australian cycling. National Sport reporter David Mark has the story.
From Australia, Jai Hindley has stepped into history.
It's a beautiful feeling, really. Yeah, a lot of emotions out there today.
Hindley set up the win on Saturday when he attacked the former race leader, Olympic champion Richard Carapaz, to lead by more than a minute.
This is the moment for Hindley to be the hero of the Giro.
It was down to the final stage time trial to cement the win. He crossed the line just 7 seconds slower than Carapaz to become the first Australian Giro d'Italia winner.
Hindley has created history.
He's now just the second Australian to win one of cycling's 3 Grand Tours, after Cadel Evans led the way, winning the 2011 Tour de France.
Cadel's first win in the Tour de France was monumental. Jai's win in the Tour of Italy is just as big.
I'm really, really proud to be Australian and, happy to take this one home.
I think it's going to be very, very encouraging for kids who were perhaps looking for someone that they can cheer for at these races and encourage them to get involved in the sport, and that's exactly how Jai Hindley got involved.
Hindley may be an overnight household name, but this win was 20 years in the making, and it began at Western Australia's Midland Cycle Club.
He came out to the velodrome, which is just based outside of Perth, near Midland,
And this is where it all started.
The future is looking very bright for Australian contenders in the Grand Tours, with Jack Haig third in last year's Tour of Spain and Ben O'Connor, who won a stage and came fourth overall in last year's Tour de France.
I really think it's going to help inspire the next generation of young guys and girls around the country to once again prove that, you know, Australians can do anything.
Jai Hindley is due for a break, but this year's Tour of Spain and next year's Tour de France could be the next targets. Tonight, though, he's partying in pink. David Mark, ABC News.
New South Wales Blues coach Brad Fittler has defended his decision to drop former Origin stars Josh Addo-Carr and Jake Trbojevic for Game 1 of the series against Queensland. James Tedesco will captain the 22-man squad, which includes 6 Penrith Panthers players and 5 debutants. The Blues have returned to camp in Coogee and will host the series opener next Wednesday.
New South Wales coach Brad Fittler promised surprises, and his new Blues lineup has certainly delivered.
That was one of those ones where the team had to come first.
Fresh faces include Joseph Sawali, Stephen Crichton, Ryan Mattison, Nico Hines and Katoni Staggs.
It was obviously a surprise. I didn't really think much of Origin. I was just trying to play good footy for the Roosters, and to get a goal in was it's quite surreal.
Aiming for Tupou.
6'4" flying winger Daniel Tupou got an unexpected recall.
Nah, not at all. Still trying to soak it all in, and a bit of a shock.
That's at the expense of Josh Addo-Carr.
Without a doubt, he's been the heart and soul of this team for a few years now, so that was the toughest call.
Jake Trbojevic was another shock omission, while Latrell Mitchell and Tom Trbojevic are out injured.
100%. Those are massive names, that have been injured and they couldn't make it.
Many expected in-form Crichton to be starting as centre. Instead, Fittler's opted for Katoni Staggs and Jack Whiten.
And the big thing with Jack, he's played in that position for us quite often, done a really good job. And I think, given he's had a couple of weeks off, I thought these last 2 games he's looked really fresh.
Brad Fittler has taken a different approach to his Blues selection this year, prioritising form over loyalty, with all but 2 players chosen coming from teams in the top 8. The Blues host Game 1 in Sydney before heading to Perth and Brisbane. Chloe Hart, ABC News.
Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal will resume their rivalry when they meet in the French Open quarter-finals tomorrow night. World number 1 Djokovic defeated Argentina's Diego Schwartzman in straight sets. 13-time champion Nadal took almost 4.5 hours to overcome Canadian Felix Auger-Aliassime.
What a way to finish!
Tomorrow, gonna try my best as always. I don't know what can happen, but the only thing that I can guarantee is I'm gonna fight until the end. So many thanks.
In the women's draw, 19-year-old Leila Fernandez remains on course for a possible semi-final against fellow teenager Coco Gauff after both players won their 4th round matches. Time now for the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow the coldest air arrives in the nation's southeast. A strong southerly wind dragging up to very cold air from well to the south, and those bunched up isobars mean strong winds from South Australia through New South Wales and up to southeast Queensland. In fact, there are warnings for damaging winds. In the west, a warning of heavy rainfall in the northwest of the Pilbara and far southwest of the Kimberley. So showers in Queensland's southern interior, especially around the Granite Belt, but mostly sunny elsewhere. Windy in Brisbane. In New South Wales, showers mostly along the ranges and also the western slopes, and there will be some snow around above 700 to 800 metres. Windy in Sydney, windy in Canberra, along with some showers. And showers and thunderstorms on and south of the ranges in Victoria. Just a few showers in the north. Snow lowering to 600 metres during the day. Cold, wet and windy in Melbourne. In Tasmania, showers will spread throughout. Snow down to 600 metres elevation. That's in western and central areas. In Hobart, you are in for afternoon showers. Showers over central and eastern parts of South Australia's southern agricultural area. In Adelaide, windy with showers. Showers over the Pilbara, northern and southern goldfields and southern parts of the southwest land division. Also out here in the Eucla, but dry in Perth. And potentially heavy rain expected over the southwest Kimberley, interior and northeastern Gascoyne. In the Territory, possible showers over the Tanami, Lassiter and western Simpson districts, and a possible afternoon storm for Darwin.
Thank you, Paul Higgins. That's ABC Late News to the moment. For more at any time, you can go to our website or you can live stream the ABC News channel at any time on iView. I'm Michael Tetlow. Thanks for your company. Take care. Good night.
This is a story 2 decades in the making.
In 1999, I was the ABC's Moscow correspondent when a man few Russians had even heard of suddenly came to power.
The inside story of the rise of Putin.
Many fear it marks the beginning of the end of Russian democracy.
A dictator threatening humanity.
Зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
How much further can Putin go?
Nobody is safe.
Foreign Correspondent, Thursday at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
Why do we have to be held to account for the mess that Morrison government has left us?
And you never know what might happen.
Thank goodness you're not running the government.
Well, you're not running it either anymore. Thank God for that.
On the eve of the 30th anniversary of the historic Mabo decision, Stan Grant is joined by Gail Mabo, Linda Burney, Chris Kenny and Shireen Morris. Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
It doesn't change who you are.
The Prime Minister told Parliament
justice and humanity.
Welcome to the program. The Liberal and National parties have elected new leaders and meetings are starting in Canberra for returning politicians, plus the 22 new MPs joining the federal parliament. Results in a few seats are still undecided and the detailed post-mortems about exactly what happened on the 21st of May are only just beginning. Here's 7:30's chief political correspondent, Laura Tingle.
Canberra is in for a massive shake-up today.
The dust is far from settled.
The Greens are on the hunt for a bigger meeting space in Parliament House.
One of the biggest shifts in Australian political history.
Morning, Michelle. How are you? Excited to be back. Welcome to Parliament.
The coalition will look to rebuild itself today.
There's a bit of a debate about whether the party should tack left to try and win back those moderate Liberal seats.
I think we just stay right in the middle.
It was all change in Canberra today.
Mr Morrison, where did it all go wrong for you?
A new government, new coalition party leaders, familiar faces in unfamiliar corridors, new rhetorical formulas being tried out.
One team, one dream.
A conspicuous new presence of women in leadership positions.
This is about the future.
A sensible centre is where you win elections.
I want our country to support aspiration and to reward hard work, to take proper care of those Australians who short-term or long-term can't take care of themselves.
This was all happening even as the vote was still being counted in some seats and as the messages of the election were still being digested. There's obviously been a lot of focus on the many independents who won seats, contributing to a record crossbench of 16 MPs. But just as important in understanding how the election result could change the way Australian politics functions is to look at what happened in seats that didn't change hands and in seats where both major parties suffered big swings to minor parties. The bottom line is that while there was a government-losing swing against the coalition, Labor's primary vote also went marginally backwards. Both the Coalition and Labor lost votes to One Nation and to the Greens, a trend that could spell more big trouble for the major parties and force them to change the way they operate in the future.
There is a message there for both major parties. It's basically telling them that the way they're conducting politics is not the way people want them to conduct politics. And it's, to a certain extent, a product of our voting system, where we have preferential voting. We give preferences to parties. The major parties therefore go to the centre. They have a smaller target. It breeds more negative personal politics because they lack that policy differentiation.
If you're unhappy with the mainstream or there was a particular issue that you wanted action on and felt strongly about, you really had to go somewhere else with your vote to get action on that.
That's not necessarily the way our politicians are seeing the outcome, though. At least some of them, including newly minted opposition leader Peter Dutton, saw the shift to minor parties as a passing protest vote.
People weren't happy with us in the end, that's clear. They weren't that enamoured with Mr Albanese, and I think many of them have sent a protest vote through the Greens, and we will talk more about that.
Whereas political researcher Tony Mitchellmore thinks this is just a continuation of a longer-term trend.
The biggest story in politics, at least when you talk to swinging voters, for a decade now, hasn't been whether Turnbull or Shorten or Morrison or Albanese are winning. It's been that they're both losing. That both, there's been this disdain for politics, this perception of personal self-interest and party self-interest ahead of national interest and ahead of the interests of voters themselves. That perception's been there and really strong for a long time.
But this election has seen that perception turn into a voting outcome which is literally unprecedented in the modern era. Political scientist Annika Gowya says you have to go back to the period just after Federation to see the federal parliament comprised of so many independents and crossbenchers, but that when you do, some striking parallels emerge.
I think that in a way, politics has almost come full circle in Australia. Political parties just after Federation were seen as rather suspicious groupings, not to be trusted, as something that could compromise the interests of each of the states and the territories. What's even more interesting is that women who had just recently been enfranchised at that point were also very, very sceptical of party politics. They thought that the party system was something that was designed to represent men's interest, and didn't really leave much room for women's issues to be discussed in the parliament.
It was this period, she says, that saw the emergence of activists like Vida Goldstein. The seat named in her honour fell on polling day to independent candidate Zoe Daniel.
What we have achieved here is extraordinary.
Holster Jim Reid says the emergence of the independents forced the government to fight the election campaign on two fronts.
There was one against Labor, whereas basically Albo versus ScoMo. That was the air war, and then you had a ground war where you had very local fights with moderate Liberals in inner city seats versus the independents and ultimately the Greens as well.
And most analysts feel that the independents are a trend that is now here to stay.
Look, if the major parties can't improve in the way they behave, in the perceptions of and differentiate from each other a little bit more, then you have to think the independents are here to stay, particularly when it's so much easier for them to reach people through social media.
Jim Reid believes that while the independents movement may have hit the coalition hardest in this election, they pose a threat to Labor at the next one.
And the next seats to be hit are the inner suburban Labor seats. I think Labor's actually got a big problem here, because to combat that independent local niche marketing appeal, you have to have quasi-independent members who can speak out, who can cross the floor, who can raise issues of their own, and that's quite difficult in Labor Party's quite strict processes.
He says there are problems too for the Liberals in combating the independents. It comes down to mass appeal versus tightly targeted appeal. That changes both their messages and the way their candidates campaign.
They're a bit like VB or TUIs. They're always going to sell lots of beer nationwide, but they don't have the ability to communicate very clearly and concisely with niche markets. So where there's locally crafted ales, they're always going to win local seats. And the major parties need to combat that, and really the only way they can do that is to allow their candidates to become more like franchisees than employees.
No matter what ticket they ran on, this election has also produced a much more diverse parliament.
The fact that we've had more women elected this time round, that we have a more diverse parliament in terms of our First Nations representatives, people from diverse ethnic backgrounds, I think that that's going to change substantively the culture of the parliament as well.
They are going to be a bad government. There's no doubt in my mind about that.
Political analysts say the major parties will have to change their game if they want to survive.
Thank you so much.
Perhaps recognising this, the new Prime Minister has already said this shift in tone will be a priority.
I think politically that's just a really strong idea. In a way, it's just as important as your voters' perceptions of how good you are on the economy, on education or health, if he can change the game, if people can have a better regard for politicians, then that's a big political win.
Only when they put out a big positive vision will they start to get that primary vote back from the minor parties.
As is always the case with the immediate aftermath of an election, there's a lot going on in politics at the moment. Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle's with me from Canberra. Laura, firstly on foreign affairs, China is shelving its regional agreement in the Pacific, for the time being at least.
Yes, that happened late this afternoon, Lee, and essentially it's because the Pacific Island nations said, look, we work on consensus here and we don't have it, so the agreement has been shelved. Now, that's obviously a good start for the Albanese government, and there was so much alarm about this agreement, but it does show that sort of the politics of these things can't really be determined too far in advance.
As we heard earlier, the coalition parties both elected new leaders today. What are the early signals about how Peter Dutton will approach the job of opposition leader?
Well, I think we can see that he's going to be a very robust opposition leader. He's already basically consigned the new Labor government to history as a failure. But it's interesting, he's positioned himself as somebody who says we've got to look after people who can't look after themselves. He's acknowledged that walking out on the apology to the stolen generations was a mistake, but he's still hedging his bets a little bit on climate. He says he's passionate about doing something about climate change, so signalling that there might be some room for manoeuvre there, but still talking about the fact it's got to be very sensible. And at the same time, we saw David Littleproud take over the Nationals from Barnaby Joyce, and his message was all about the sensible centre and not going to extremes and running down rabbit holes. So they're certainly trying to send some messages out there. They've elected women deputies, and they're also sending the message that they have heard the message from the women of Australia.
Now that Labor is in government, how likely is the public service to see a bit of a shake-up?
I think there's quite a lot of quite a significant shake-up coming, Lee. They're not going to do a sort of night of the long knives, but today we saw the appointment of Glyn Davis, the former Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, appointed to head the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet instead of Phil Gaetjens, who was very close to Scott Morrison. And I think this is going to be one of the first of a lot of changes in the public sector. The Labor Party believes that the public service has really been run down, particularly over the last decade, and they want to build it up again, get its credibility back and get its capacity back. So I think this is a really important signal that there's a lot of change coming.
Laura Tingle, thank you.
Thanks, Lee.
And tonight the ABC is declaring that Labor will govern in its own right after securing a majority in the House of Representatives. The party's retained the Melbourne seat of Macnamara, meaning it will hold at least 76 seats in the lower house, the bare minimum for majority government. 2 seats remain in doubt. President Joe Biden has visited the small Texan town that's home to the latest round of devastating gun violence. An 18-year-old boy with semi-automatic assault weapons shot dead 19 children and 2 teachers. As North America correspondent Carrington Clark reports, after more than 2 decades of mass shootings at American schools, there's little reason to think this will be the last.
Once again, an American town is counting the terrible cost of gun violence. Uvalde is weeping for the children it's lost. The world's media has descended on this town of about 15,000 people after a teenage gunman went on a deadly rampage. Days after the shootings, authorities admitted police had waited for more than an hour to storm the classroom, holding parents back outside while their children made a series of emergency calls begging for help.
Having the benefit of hindsight where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision, it was the wrong decision, period.
There's no excuse for that.
Amid an outpouring of national horror over the decision to leave the children to their fate for more than an hour, the Federal Justice Department has launched an investigation into the police response.
I'm a mother now, you know, and you see all these kids' faces and the parents who've lost. You know, being a parent, you see a whole, what we experienced at Columbine, we were students. I have a piece of the glass from the bullets that I got.
Among the faces at the vigil are two people who've travelled across the country to be here, survivors of a school massacre that shocked America more than 20 years ago.
You almost do become numb to the violence, and that is devastating, and this should not be normal. Precious life should never be taken, and so it is heartbreaking that this is the broken world we live in.
Witnesses and police heard explosions. Explosive devices were later found inside and outside the school.
13 people died when two students opened fire at Columbine High School in Colorado back in 1999.
I came into the library and shot everybody around me.
It was an elementary school, the oldest child believed to be only 10.
10 years ago, calls for tighter gun controls intensified after 20 young children were killed by a lone gunman at Sandy Hook.
Heavily armed police swarmed one of Florida's biggest schools.
In 2018, Fred Guttenberg lost his daughter Jamie, one of 17 people shot dead at a Florida high school.
It isn't only about the person who was killed by the bullet. It's all of the other effects. For example, my son was also in the school that day. My son heard the shots that killed his sister. So now my son is impacted.
At the weekend, thousands demonstrated outside the National Rifle Association's convention in Houston. Inside, guests including former President Donald Trump rejected any need for tighter gun laws after this latest slaughter.
The existence of evil is one of the very best reasons to arm law-abiding citizens.
What stops armed bad guys is armed good guys.
Where's the backbone? Where's the courage to stand up to a very powerful lobby?
Today, as the US president paid his respects, political action on assault weapons remains an unlikely prospect.
I am angry at every one of the legislators, whether you're a senator, a governor, or a representative, who continues to push the same line of bullshit on America over why they can't or won't do anything about the reality of gun violence.
So about 180 kilometres from where the people of Uvalde are just starting the mourning process for the 21 lives that they've lost is the small Texan town of Sutherland Springs. It still has the site of the largest massacre in Texas history. In November 2017, a gunman stormed a church service. He killed 26 people before he himself was shot.
I never once thought that I would lose my son, and by the grace of God I didn't. But he could have very easily have bled to death right there on the church floor.
Julie's son survived the 2017 shooting, but was left paralysed, and she says the whole town remains damaged.
Anybody who heard the gunshots, it's affected them. I mean, as human nature, you always go back to what should... You know what that was, don't you?
What?
That's gunfire.
No.
Mm-hmm. Somebody is either target practicing or something. Hold on just a second. Let me take a deep breath.
Joanne was like a daughter to me.
Terry Smith lost one of her best friends in the attack. Joanne Ward died along with two of her daughters, 5-year-old Brooke and 7-year-old Emily.
Joanne shielded her children. She threw herself over her children to shield them, and the bullets went through her to them. And to me, that's just a mom of gold. A mom made of 100% gold.
But despite the devastation assault-style weapons have wrought in this town, there's still mixed feelings about gun control.
I honestly, I don't know. I don't know what that would look like, because I don't have all the facts in front of me laid out, you know, on the table.
The majority of the people carry a weapon now, you know, and that shouldn't have to be the way of life when it's not a war zone, when it's a peaceful neighborhood like this.
As Uvalde prepares to bury its children, parents across the country are left to fear for their own children.
It's brought back a lot of flashbacks, a lot of emotion. It's sad. It's sad.
I always pray over my kids every time, you know, when they're coming and going as I drop them off at school, because there is like always something in the back of my mind that's like, what if? What if?
During the past decade, experts have learned more and more about the way that repeated concussions can cause serious injury and a brain illness known as CTE. In the AFL, after a player suffers a concussion, they're forced to sit on the sidelines for at least 12 days. But some experts claim that's not long enough. Reporter Elias Kluwer and producer Laura Cooley take a deeper look.
About to head to Marvel Stadium, the Bulldogs and Collingwood. Make sure you join us.
It's an institution. The players are put up there as heroes. It is absolutely everything.
It's like a religion. There's over 1 million Australians who are paid up members, which makes them one of the most formidable entities in the country.
Norton there as well. Dacos got past it, McComb. Norton bouncing it through.
In the Southern Capitals, Australian rules football is the biggest show in town, and its governing league, the AFL, is all-powerful.
Well, John Cain, the former Victorian Premier, he said to me that the AFL was the most powerful public entity he'd encountered.
Its outgoing CEO, Gillan McLachlan, is currently negotiating a new TV deal, tipped to pour billions through AFL coffers. But the AFL is still confronted by a very expensive problem.
I think there will be a reckoning if the AFL and other codes have a closed shop around this issue.
Chad Rintoul spent 6 years in the AFL from the late 90s into the early 2000s.
I was having migraines like 4 days in a row, just spewing up, couldn't get in bed.
Rintoul's concussions were suffered in an era where little was known about the long-term effects of hits to the head.
I didn't miss a week once I was concussed at all. I used to pass the concussion test as best I could.
By the mid-2000s, damning research into concussion injuries was quickly emerging out of the United States. And back in Australia, then AFL team doctor Michael McDeasy conducted a landmark study of all concussed players from the years 2000 to 2003. Rintoul was forced to retire during that same period after suffering back-to-back concussions in 2002.
Chad Rintoul may have got the worst of it, but they've both regained their footing.
But he was excluded from the study because researchers chose not to examine players who left the game after their injury, citing there'd be insufficient opportunity to follow up with them. In total, 61 concussive incidents were excluded from the study for similar reasons, meaning almost 40% of players who suffered a concussion were ignored.
I was just surprised. I mean, the study can't be accurate and correct if you're missing out on a lot of data.
So right hand just sitting there.
Now, two academics are speaking out. raising concerns that the study, which the AFL used to justify its concussion policy at the time, was flawed.
Well, it certainly doesn't give people confidence in science. Why are some people left out of the research data collection and others are kept in?
I think that the absolute academic rigour is at question now.
Michael McDeasy is now the Chief Medical Officer of the AFL. In a statement, the AFL said it has full confidence in Dr McDeasy.
Trust is lacking. I know that overseas, there have been parliamentary inquiries into similar issues with other sports, and the comment that's come back is that these sports are marking their own homework.
Today, the AFL says protecting players' heads is paramount and stipulates players must spend a minimum 12 days away from the sport while recovering from a concussion. But the league is yet to reveal where that 12-day figure came from. Rowena Mobbs is a neurologist based in Sydney.
The science is pointing towards possibly longer time off play and taking a conservative approach. Many of us in neuroscience would advocate 4 weeks away.
The AFL's CEO, Gillan McLachlan, has not ruled out players spending a mandatory 28 days on the sidelines, but claims the evidence so far doesn't support it.
Well, if that was the advice, we'd take it. But that's not the advice at the moment.
But a Monash University study of amateur players published in April concluded that 12 days rest is insufficient, and that some players have been cleared to return to footy before their brains have fully recovered. Monash is currently receiving funding grants from the AFL. Michael Warner has reported on the AFL for Melbourne's biggest newspaper, the Herald Sun.
Now, once you start getting into 30 days, that's a very big price to pay, and particularly for broadcasters, I imagine, who want to see the best players playing.
The AFL's CEO, Gillan McLachlan, and Chief Medical Officer, Dr Michael McDeasy, declined an interview with 7:30. In a statement, the AFL defended its policy, saying it's not aware of any evidence that any specific period of absence provides any guarantee of safety, and that the current mandated 12-day rest period is a minimum period, noting that when a player does return, it's ultimately up to the clinical judgment of accredited AFL club doctors, and nothing in the guidelines compels a doctor to return a player after only 12 days. It also said many club doctors may choose to use the Monash study's findings to inform their judgment. Associate Professor Alan Pearce was a former collaborator with the AFL.
It has been discussed that 12 days was decided based upon a body of evidence that many of my colleagues are unsure what it is.
Can she kick the Tigers first? She can.
He says the issue extends far beyond the nation's biggest arenas.
Anyone who's exposed to repetitive trauma is at risk of CTE. It doesn't matter if they play D grade or they're playing the AFL, a hit to the head is a hit to the head.
The AFL have always been able to be judged to execution on their own internal integrity investigations. I don't think there's any doubt that somewhere down the track the AFL is going to have to pay out a lot of money, tens of millions if not more, to former players who have endured head knocks.
Kim Klomp never played in the AFL, but was a champion in South Australia's top state league.
I'd have times when I went through a red light and I didn't know I was going through a red light. I was just there, vagueness.
For the first time, Kim's revealing he believes he has CTE and that it almost cost him his life, likening himself to former AFL player Danny Frawley, who died by suicide in 2019. A post-mortem examination confirmed Frawley had CTE.
I ended up in hospital. With me, it was more of a call for help. But if I didn't want to have that call for help, it would have been me.
Due to concussion of forward Kim Klomp. Like Jarman, he too didn't train, but says he'll almost certainly play on Sunday.
When I was playing footy, concussion was like a cramp. You get rid of the cramp, you go on. Get rid of the concussion, you get on.
Kim Klomp has never heard from South Australia's top league or the AFL, but all he wants is for the players now to be safe.
Anything that can be done for your brain, as soon as it happens, the better off people would be.
Yeah, straight into Salem's hip, Lee. A bit ugly this, and he's not feeling well, and he's had a bit of a delayed effect there as well, so this is going to hold the game up, and rightly so.
You can find the full statement from the AFL on our website. And if that story has raised any issues for you, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. That's the program for tonight. Thanks for your company. Good night.
Warm up with Gardening Australia.
It's a great time of the year to get out into the garden.
We dig into what makes healthy soil.
So no synthetic fertilisers, no pesticides, herbicides, fungicides.
Show you how to fuel your garden for free.
It might cost a little bit of time and effort, but it is well worth it.
And meet a botanical artist with a passion for prints.
Being able to put beautiful fabrics on people's bodies and then they care more about that plant, that's pretty good for me.
Gardening Australia. Friday on ABC TV and ABC iView. Join innovators and trailblazers.
How about this for our first date?
For one final trip down memory lane.
I started choreographing my first work here. Wow.
This is like where I grew up.
God, it hasn't changed.
Plus, the most emotional homecoming yet.
What a privilege to be part of this.
In Julius Amiro's very own home delivery.
Oh my goodness. I would have loved to walk through here with him.
Starts Sunday, June 19 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
Why do we have to be held to account for the mess that Morrison government has left us?
And you never know what might happen.
Thank goodness you're not running the government.
Well, you're not running it either anymore.
Well, I never...
On the eve of the 30th anniversary of the historic Mabo decision, Stan Grant is joined by Gail Mabo, Linda Burney, Chris Kenny and Shireen Morris. Q&A, Thursday on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Julian Assange is the hero of our times.
My name is John Shifton. I'm Julian Assange's father.
The maximum sentence of 175 years because he